listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is time for another edition of the most disruptive show in those United States. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get into the news. In the headlines this morning, in COVID news, Spain says that 355,000 more people were left unemployed in the third quarter, bringing the total jobless rate up to 16.3% from 15.3% in the previous 3-month period. New virus restrictions hurt economic development. The National Statistics Institute said on Tuesday that the total number of people out of work now in Spain stood at 3.7 million. Some 1 million people lost their jobs in the second quarter as the effects of lockdowns during the first virus wave crippled the economy. Protests took place across Italy on Monday over new restrictions to curb these countries' second wave of COVID. Clashes were reported in the northern cities of Milan and Turin, where petrol bombs were thrown at officers. And in Milan, tear gas was used to disperse protesters. Thousands of people gathered in the center of Naples there. The demonstrations began soon after the national government's order to close restaurants, bars, gyms, and cinemas came into effect at 6 p.m. local time. According to various reports, President Trump plans to announce an initiative to issue early vaccines for COVID-19 free of cost to recipients of Medicare and Medicaid. The administration is expected to announce a plan to cover vaccines that receive emergency use authorization from the Food and Drug Administration, that's the FDA, of course. The change could help millions receive a coronavirus vaccine for free. This comes as the U.S. has reported more than 74,300 new cases of the coronavirus, of COVID-19, on Monday, pushing the country's daily average over the past week above 71,000. That's the most in any 7-day stretch. It's a 1-week period of the pandemic. In election news, early ballots are coming in massive numbers, more than 59 million total ballots cast as of Monday morning. That's a record turnout for this year's race compared to the 47.2 million early votes cast in the 2016 election, according to data from the United States Elections Project. So more than 11 million more votes cast early this cycle than last cycle. The number of early ballots cast so far represents 43.1% of the total national voter turnout in 2016. Jamarl, that's massive turnout compared to what we've seen before. Democrats, as far as I can tell, sort of passively trying to cover up for allegations of voter fraud. That's the Republicans' allegation, at least. Of course, this is probably just people at home at the pandemic, during the pandemic, trying to, be involved politically. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, Republicans have been screaming voter fraud with voter ID laws, interstate cross-check. It's basically scream voter fraud while you commit voter fraud. It's just like Russian disinformation. It's like saying Russian disinformation is usually Russian disinformation, or is usually disinformation to hide from something else in our domestic politics. No, I mean, these are the same guys who kept saying, oh, there's voter fraud all over the place. And then when you do the measurement, little to none. And what makes it even that much more insistent, or that much worse, is that oftentimes what we're talking about here are these guys trying to find ways to eliminate certain people off the rolls that are against their candidacy. Look, the more people you have voting, typically Democrats tend to do better in those elections. I suspect this is not going to be any different.
I mean, and in past election cycles, what's primarily come up here in that, like, the voter fraud conversation, I think, is Republicans accusing Democrats of trying to harness the Democrat side is minority votes, which, frankly, everybody who's a citizen of the U.S. should be able to vote. But in past election cycles, it was about Democrats accusing Republicans of using, like, illegal immigrants' votes. That was kind of part of the thing, or people who weren't eligible to vote. That's the fundamental controversy here, contradiction.
Yeah, but they say
Anyway.
that in order to shave people off the voter rolls. And you can look at the number of people who were shaved off. I mean, you're talking about like hundreds of thousands of people for like 3 people for voter fraud stuff. Like, it's so out of whack that the reason and the rationale for making the argument is entirely to exclude certain people from the voting equation. Those people who would be antagonistic to your voting interests. That's what it is. It's politics.
I hear you on that. I hear you. This comes as the Senate has confirmed that Judge Amy Coney Barrett, a conservative appeals court judge and protege of former Justice Antonin Scalia, as a new nominee to the Supreme Court. Republicans overcame unanimous Democratic opposition to make Judge Barrett the 115th Justice of the Supreme Court and the 5th woman to be nominated to that court. The vote was 52-48, with all but one Republican, Susan Collins of Maine, who is battling for re-election, supporting her. It was the first time in 151 years that a justice was confirmed without the support of a single member of the minority party. Vice President Joe Biden on Monday night slammed the rushed and unprecedented confirmation. Biden issued the condemnation in a lengthy statement released shortly after Barrett was officially sworn into the nation's highest court. And a quote here: "The rushed and unprecedented confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett as Associate Justice to the Supreme Court in the middle of an ongoing election should be a stark reminder to every American that your vote matters," end quote. Barrett will begin hearing cases immediately. And again, she is the 5th female justice in the court's history. That's, of course, not on the current court, but in the history of justices on the court. In foreign policy, you know what, Jamarl? We were talking about this over the last couple of weeks. What's your take on this?
You mean Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation?
Yes.
I think Mitch McConnell got a win. And I think whether it's a win or not is entirely dependent upon your view of what America is, what America should be. But from a blunt politics angle, Mitch McConnell won. He gets a win. And he gets a win that's going to outlast his lifespan on an order of magnitude of multiple decades. So, you can look at this from a purely political angle. You can look at this from a country angle, and you can make a priority on which one matters more. In this very specific case, though, Mitch McConnell gets a win.
And that's a 2/3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court,
yes,
if I'm reading that right.
Yeah.
That's 6-3.
And 3 of them were put there by Trump, meaning 1/3 of the members were put there by Donald Trump himself. Isn't that amazing?
It is, but that's also not something that anybody, maybe with the exception of this last one, that would happen under any Republican president. So I'm not sure that's going to matter too much for voters.
Oh, that's like the wild part.
Are looking at this.
Because you're right. Any Republican president would have done the exact same thing.
It's true. Yeah. All right. In foreign policy news, in Bangladesh, around 10,000 people rallied in the South Asian nation's capital on Tuesday to protest France's president and his staunch support of secular laws that deem caricatures depicting the Prophet Muhammad as protected under freedom of speech. Protesters from the conservative Islami Andalan Bangladesh group, which supports the introduction of a blasphemy law in the Muslim-majority country, carried banners and placards reading, "All Muslims of the world unite and boycott France." It was the largest protest yet against the cartoons in recent days. Some carried portraits of French President Emmanuel Macron with an X on his face. One protester carried a cutout image of the French president with shoes around his neck as a sign of insults. In Syria, a U.S. airstrike in northwestern Syria is believed to have killed 7 leaders of al-Qaeda affiliates. That's according to a military official. The struck was conducted on October 22nd as the alleged terrorists were meeting near the city of Idlib. This is according to spokeswoman Major Beth Riordan of Central Command. The 7 people who were killed were not identified, but Riordan said airstrikes like this will damage the terrorist group as they attempt to attack Americans and U.S. allies across the globe. On Monday, Afghanistan officials said that they killed a top al-Qaeda propagandist who is on the FBI's most wanted list. Google on Tuesday said it will ban all ads related to the U.S. election after polls close November 3rd, adding it expects the ban to last at least a week. The company cited its sensitive events policy which seeks to stop brands from profiting off fast-moving critical events. Election results will probably take longer to confirm this year as more people vote by mail, said Google in a blog post Tuesday. They also said that the ban is necessary to, quote, limit the potential for ads to increase confusion post-election, end quote. The ban will cover any ad that mentions a candidate, a political party, or an election, among other election-related content. Google used the same policy to halt political ads when protests broke out following the election in Belarus in August. More of the same overreach, as far as I can tell here, at least on that last count. But, if they're cutting out ads after the election, of course, most people who are concerned about Google's suppression of political news and attempts to control the political cycle, what they're worried about is what's going on in advance of the election. But maybe they're feeling the pressure from that antitrust lawsuit, as Facebook and Twitter, as the primary social media companies, of course, seem to have been doing the most of that overreach. Jamarl, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Basically, if you're going to make the argument, or people making this argument of eliminating certain conversations that you don't necessarily like because they're inopportune, that seems to be the issue. Not this notion of, okay, we're going to stop this ad or that ad during the... No. What's taking place right now with the protection of Joe Biden, it seems... I mean, it's one thing if they directly dealt with the story and if they engaged the story and everything else, the Hunter Biden stuff. But they don't. And you have to ask the question, why not? And are they doing this for the protection of Biden? That's what it seems. Especially since there hasn't been any clear delineation to show that this was wrong. Meaning, this is not a situation where they're dealing with the information and then coming away and say, okay, this is wrong. This is them trying to eliminate it and pretend it doesn't exist. That's the issue. The other stuff, the secondary, that's more of an important issue right now. I mean, they did the same thing to Jacobin. Think about that, Jacobin. How do you eliminate an article from Jacobin? It may not be mainstream, but it's certainly not off the wall. And yet, whether it's Press TV, whether it's Teleserve, whether it's the Palestinian websites, whether the gentleman that we had on yesterday, Maruth, in all of these cases, yeah, it seems like our tech companies seem to be working for very clear interests. And that interest is not in the interest of free speech. That is not in the interest of allowing political discussions or stuff like that. No, it's in the interest of curbing certain speech and not others. It becomes selective at a certain point.
And one weird take here is that this is actually an instance of capitalism not being very capitalistic. This might be in their personal economic interest, but only in the sense that they're trying to defend themselves against a government that wants them to suppress political speech. That's really the only sort of deeper take that I can have here. Sure, you have a cultural wave. You have liberals in these companies who, many conservatives fear that the moderation, the editorialization, all that stuff, the political suppression, frankly, that's associated with liberals being in the companies or progressives being in the companies. But more broadly, it seems pretty darn clear, especially with this antitrust lawsuit against Google and a wider wave of threats of antitrust lawsuits against these other companies, that, they're basically kowtowing to the political establishment, which is, again, just an interesting instance of capitalism not being capitalistic.
I would say it is being very capitalistic because it's trying to ensure that its business model stays intact. Yeah,
but aren't they doing that in response to a state? I mean, aren't they doing that basically because if they don't do it, a state will shut them down?
They are, but there's all sorts of stuff that's that way. I mean, the handicap stuff, allowing an African-American to come into your store, a person who's gay. All of those things are being done because they're terrified that the government is going to shut them down. That's just kind of part and parcel to the job.
But I guess my point here is that they're not doing it out of pursuit of a profit. They're doing it to, not be shut down by a state. That's not capitalism, that's authoritarianism.
I disagree with that. Like I said, there's always going to be rules that the companies have to follow. But you're right. We can talk about it later.
Fair enough. All right. And a Miami-Dade police report, last headline here, just throwing this one in. A Miami-Dade police report said on Friday, said that the Florida Highway Patrol responded to a crash on the Palmetto Expressway Sunday afternoon and found the human remains of an aspiring hip-hop artist inside the trunk of a crashed silver Acura. Troopers towed the car to the parking lot of of Hialeah's Westland Mall and became suspicious of the driver when he asked to remove his belongings from the car, which included a gun case. Authorities said they were also suspicious because they noticed buzzing flies and the smell of rotting flesh around the car. Troopers opened the trunk and found a body wrapped in a piece of fabric and in an advanced stage of decomposition. That's according to a police report. An autopsy revealed Trotter was fatally shot multiple times. The two had been friends for more than a decade. A weird story there. Anyway, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. That last one is truly random. Anyway, we're going into a break right now. We're going to be back in a minute with Jamarl's monologue. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in DC. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, wherever or whatever platform you're consuming this content on, definitely give us a like and definitely share that content. You can also send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Definitely feel free to call. So, Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed. Now, let's be very, very clear. This is what a win looks like. This is what a blunt, hardcore, over the course of several years, political win looks like. Let's hear the confirmation from Amy Coney Barrett.
Thanks also to the Senate for giving its consent to my appointment. I am grateful for the confidence you have expressed in me, and I pledge to you and to the American people that I will discharge my duties to the very best of my ability. This was a rigorous confirmation process, and I thank all of you, especially Leader McConnell and Chairman Graham, for helping me to navigate it.
Was it a rigorous confirmation hearing? It's the fastest in the history of confirmation hearings from the standpoint of the Supreme Court. Rigorous. It's not a word I would use. Also, it wasn't necessarily the confidence of the Senate, more so as the want of the Republicans. Yeah, the Senate Republicans, and I would imagine all sorts of Republicans, especially the plutocrats out there, have a great belief in your capabilities and your skills on that bench in the upcoming, 20, 30, 40, 50 years that Coney Barrett will be on that bench. This, like I said, is a win. It is a blunt political win. It's going to be fascinating to see Joe Biden incrementally tweak Obamacare when Obamacare doesn't exist because it was struck down by the same new Supreme Court pick, Amy Coney Barrett. I want to hear Mitch McConnell for the moment. Listen to Mitch McConnell. This is what a man gloating sounds like.
We've made an important contribution to the future of this country. A lot of what we've done over the last 4 years will be undone sooner or later by the next election. They won't be able to do much about this for a long time to come. Fortunately for Judge Barrett and for our nation, history will remember what is already clear.
The thing is, McConnell knows that at the end of the day, regardless of what people think about his record, he had no aspirations to be president or anything else. His claim to fame, his top of the line position is where he is right now. And like anybody else in their top of the line position where he is trying to do what he considers to be what he's supposed to be doing, he got her confirmed. Yes, in one breath, a few years ago, they would say, well, we can't confirm somebody on the last year of the presidency, and then immediately we're going to get this confirmation within a few weeks because power allows the option. The catch becomes, and the thing that people need to understand is that from the standpoint of McConnell and the Republicans, they had a dedicated task to accomplishing an objective. And in this very specific instance, they were able to accomplish it. They stopped Obama from getting his pick in, and they turned around and got their pick in. So now Trump gets 3 picks on the Supreme Court. Whether or not Trump is a one-term president or not, he gets his 3 picks on the court. The court is going to be a check on whatever Democratic administration gets in, especially if it's a left-leaning Democratic administration. You don't have to worry about that with Biden. And I would imagine they have no belief that Democrats have the stones to try to expand the court or put in limits on the courts. And even if they did put in limits on the Supreme Court picks, you're still going to have somebody who's going to be there for a very, 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 very long time. This, you may not like it. You may, cringe at the Obamacare ruling that may be coming up, the Roe versus Wade ruling that may be coming up, the putting Trump back in office ruling that may be coming up. You may cringe at all of this stuff. And this brings back to the question of what does it mean to win? Yes, you have a blunt political win from the standpoint of Republicans and from the standpoint of Mitch McConnell. This is the height of what he would consider to be a win for his career. By the same token, is it a win for America? And think about what I'm asking you for the moment. A Supreme Court pick was taken from one president, pure politics. By all legitimate right, Obama should have got his pick. By the same token, politics is not about all legitimate right. It's about force, leverage, and your capability of getting what you want accomplished through your skill and political acumen. Obama was looking in his navel. Merrick Garland gets tossed. Trump gets 3 picks. And this is going to reverberate through time. The catch is, however you want to look at this, yes, this is not the best thing for America. But this has nothing to do with what was in the best interest of America. This has everything to do with how do you get your political objectives accomplished and how do you beat the other party that's supposed to be stopping you or blocking you from doing that. And is the other party really doing that? Especially when their self-interest is divided. Meaning, it's one thing for the Republican Party to fight hard for the wealth of the nation. They basically are able to get through using special groups that don't necessarily care about the economic benefits or the economic impacts of those things and everything else. Democrats, at least half of the party, does care about those things. The catch is the party that is in power at this point, however, less so. And like I said, their interests are divided. You have dollars and pitchforks within the same party. And within those dollars and pitchforks, there are some things that are advantageous to the dollars, clearly, that are not advantageous to the pitchforks. Part of that is fighting politically hard to try to prevent him from getting his objectives accomplished while getting your own, which is why I go and say this is a win, specific, blunt political win for McConnell. Whether that's a win for America or not, I strongly suspect it is not. Shane, what do you think about this pick? They basically, let's be bluntly honest. They rushed the pick through. They wanted to get the pick through because they believe that Trump is probably not going to get elected again. This is something that apparently they've been talking about behind the scenes. And I got to be honest, just, rational human being looking at information saying, yeah, it looks like he has a hard way to go to win this. And so we're going to extract whatever we can. And what we're going to extract are 3 Supreme Court picks that is going to be a check on power. We also don't have any belief that Democrats are going to go through with expanding the court or packing the court. We don't believe that. And so ultimately what you have is a Supreme Court, conservative Supreme Court, that is going to last for the foreseeable future, knocking down one ruling after the next. And by the way, we keep bringing up the Obamacare stuff. It goes beyond Obamacare. It goes into environmental rulings. It goes into rulings about corporate power, reunionization, all of that stuff. All of that stuff is now up for grabs. What do you think about the confirmation? By all accounts, she should have been confirmed. Trump got his pick. It's his pick. Doesn't mean there's not going to be consequences for it reverberating through history. What do you think?
So two different takes here. One, I mean, technically, they had the mandate in the sense that they had the Senate. That's the crucial thing, of course, that they lacked, that the Democrats specifically lacked back with the Merrick Garland hearings in 2016. So they had that mandate in that sense, but that's just a technical thing. To your broader point that America probably doesn't want a supermajority of conservatives on the Supreme Court, I mean, maybe, but here's another deeper take, which is
I didn't say that.
And I hope that that's one implication there. If you're talking about rolling back policies and pushing back on things that have been in place for a long time, it's that there's some recent advances that we should be protecting and arguably some future advances that we should be pushing for in terms of policies from the Supreme Court. Anyway, a deeper take here is that it's probably not good for us to want to politicize, as we are inevitably obviously doing, the Supreme Court in that deeper way. Like, do we really want to polarize that? Or, I mean, I'll give another example of how things could go. You could have some sense that there is an objective standard in the Constitution in American history that we're sort of trying to decrypt, and that you want liberal and conservative opinions on what that stance is, but that what you're trying to do effectively is like roll out or unravel the consequences of the inevitable philosophical propositions taken up by the Constitution when it comes to jurisprudence and what's legally permissible and all these questions. And when we politicize it, what we're doing is, ultimately creating a political system that just wants court stacking, that just wants a majority of representation for one or the other political parties. And that seems much more deeply ugly to me than the alternative, which is, again, some objective constitutional standard. Jamarl, what's your take?
Why wouldn't political parties want that? Every political party in their right mind would want to do exactly what you just said. Like, that's the contradiction between the two things. We have this belief that people should function in the better angel of their natures. And you say, well, why should they function that way when real material gains are given from them not acting that way? And in this very specific case, I agree with you. That's what I think that's the point I'm trying to get to more than America wants. Because America is kind of out of it, a lot of this stuff. I'm getting more so to the point of, is it in our best interest as a country? And I would say no. Even though from the standpoint of blunt politics, Mitch McConnell accomplished what he wanted. I'm saying there's a difference, because you're right. I don't want my court biased. Like, I don't want a politicized court. I want, to the degree that they can, to be honest and straightforward. And I know, as I say that there's always a subjective content to the law. And I also know that not everybody has a belief that they want the court to be fair and honest, especially if fair and honest means they're going to be ruling against them. So I feel you in regards to, I don't want to politicize court. By the same token, this is clearly what we got. And I don't know how I don't think America it fully realizes that yet. Because they're against court packing. They're against screwing around with the court in regards to adding lengths on the justices and everything else. They want the court to stay the way the court is. Missing the point that the court is not staying the way the court is. The court never stays the way the court is, because there's always going to be additional justices in with political parties that have every impetus in the world to push for that person to act a particular way that is in the interest of their party. I just don't know how you get a non-politicized court when the process to get the court person or the Supreme Court justice is thoroughly politicized. How does that work?
You probably have to reduce, polarization and politicization of different essential institutions. Generally, you've got to push back against the party duopoly. That's like a core component of any reformist plan at fixing the state of things as they are. But you've got to change how those parties.
Yeah, how the party operates.
And maybe or change structural rulings that lead to the two parties having such power.
And how do you fix that?
Anyway,
when you only have two parties, like, that's what I mean. Like, this is not a situation where you have like multiple parties and then like a parliament and all that. This is very specific, where you have basically two leading political parties that gets to choose the Supreme Court. And we are supposed to walk away from that process thinking, yeah, these two political parties are going to be apolitical in choosing a Supreme Court pick. Why do we think that? Why do we think that? Let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas.
It's tricky. Yeah, exactly.
And Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. My name is Shane Stranahan. I am joined by my co-host, Jamarl Thomas, and we're coming to you from across the country, transmitted to you through our station in D.C. If you guys live in the D.C. area, you can catch us there on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also on in Kansas City at 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. Also, if you're digging what Jamarl and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give up a like and share the video. If you want to check us out on YouTube, just go to youtube.com/Jamarl Thomas or youtube.com/FaultLinesRadio. You can check us out on either of those feeds. We're also on audio options, including the Sputnik app, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, and Spotify. And if you want to call in at pretty much any point, you can. The number is 202-521-1320. Jamarl, we're trying to get Mark Sloboda, our guest, on. We're going to be talking about Nagorno Karabakh. This coming on the tails of a couple of weeks of different diplomatic efforts by Russia, and then this weekend the U.S. to get the conflict to simmer down, sort of freeze back up in some sense. That's the different takes you can have on this history of ethnic cleansing from both sides, sort of reciprocal back and forth, ugly history there, decades-long conflict, once billed as the most dangerous conflict in wider Europe. And I think the reason for that is not just the deaths that an active conflict would entail in that region, but in the wider region if a regional war were to kick off. Anyway, I mean, I know that you're fascinated by these conversations as a sort of question of, individual states and the rights of individual states and the influences of larger powers. Interesting stuff to look at and to think about, definitely. I mean, another side of this, though, of course, is the hundreds of thousands of lives that are on the line, not just the questions of the ideas, underlying the conflict or surrounding the attitudes that the various parties bring to the conflict, but also, of course, the threat of, a war, a violent war that could kill, displace hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. Jamarl, what's your take?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's fascinating. I mean, it's a sick fascination of sorts, if I want to, be specific about it. I get fascinated by issues of war and by issues of politics, especially when it's like politics on that high level where you're trying to either avoid a war or the politics of war, that type of stuff. Yeah, this is a fascinating topic, especially on this notion of independence. Meaning, what does it mean for a country or a piece of land to be independent? And when should that independence be validated? I'm fascinated by that question because it doesn't seem to be, there's no right answer to that question, if that makes sense. Or at the very least, there's no answer that we've come across in this world that makes sense to us. If Texas, right now, decided that it wanted to leave the United States, would the United States allow Texas to do it? The answer, of course, is no. Hong Kong is trying to say, we want to be independent. Is China going to allow it? The answer is going to be no. The Nagorno Karabakh thing takes that on a different level because now you have competing nations. And within the context of those competing nations, the world says, we consider this to be Azerbaijan territory. By the same token, the world also says, we don't want you to do anything about this. We would just want this to stay frozen. Let it ride. Now, how does the world get to have both perspectives at once? And yet it does. It's a fudge. These things are fascinating. So, when Mark comes on, we'll get the opportunity to delve into the latest. Like you said, there have been multiple efforts at peace talks, recently, even by the United States. But in this issue, the oddity is that the United States, France, and Russia are supposedly, at least optically, on the same side in this. And all of them are trying to basically say, go back to status quo, with frenemy Turkey whispering in the ear of Azerbaijan, making that much more difficult to pull off. It's a fascinating conflict. It really is. And I don't mean to be excited by it because people are dying and everything else. But from a standpoint of war and peace and the politics, like world politics, where these nations are trying to, we don't want to go back to status quo. We don't want to go back to this kind of normal that the world just kind of accepts and gives a glancing eye to. It's like saying, I want that guy to remain in a situation, but I'm not being affected by that situation. So I just want that guy to remain in it and let it ride. Whereas Azerbaijan is like, yeah, we don't want this to ride. I find that to be fascinating. And what is something that would work from a standpoint that they would accept and that Armenia would accept, where this conflict ends? Because right now they seem to be at loggerheads. Like where one side says, independence is what we need. The other side says, we want our land back. And there is no intermediary between those 2 points. One side is going to have to give some kind of face-saving maneuver in order to allow a peace talk to take place or peace deals to take place. And that's what you have. I mean, basically, you have an instigator, or let's say, at the very least, pushing the conflict, in this case of Turkey or Erdogan. And, I've done multiple stories. Erdogan just attacked Macron yesterday, saying that he needed his head checked for the Muslim stuff. The thing is, the conflict between Erdogan and Macron go deeper than just that one specific issue of the person stabbing the person in the neck or beheading, depending upon the story that you're reading. In France, it seems to go beyond into these international conflicts. Our world has gotten really interesting and dangerous all of a sudden. Because if anything happens where it spreads out, the world gets pulled in.
It does. That's the threat. But also, I mean, you're bringing up France there. The relevance there, at least in part, is that the Minsk group, which is the sort of subgrouping within the Organization for Security and Economic Development, the OSCE, the Minsk group, which is responsible for mediating this specific conflict, the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, is comprised of 3 members: the U.S., Russia, and France. So the U.S. and Russia have each stepped in to try to resolve this thing. France, as far as I can tell from the early stages, France was trying to, but now with this latest blowout between Macron and Erdogan, between France and Turkey, basically, it doesn't seem like they're going to take a useful role. They're sort of, compromised in that sense. So it really would fall to either Russia or the U.S. Russia is the natural diplomat. They're the natural intermediary and intercessor potentially in this case, just because of obviously historical associations, Azerbaijan, Armenia, both on the border of the former Soviet Union, effectively, part of it at one point, of course, and that would affect things going forward, but nothing's working, and again, the fighting goes on. And then there's this question of fundamentally, what can you actually do? Russia is not these countries. It doesn't have territorial control. It only has influence. And if you're going to come to a table and you're going to try to create a compromise, neither side is going to be happy with it. And in the long run, neither side should be happy with it in some sense, because you want each side to have to make concessions that feel approximately equal and approximately proportional, which means, they each get some of what they want. but the salt feels a lot more painful in the wound than the bandage you put on the wound. And yeah, they're going to feel that sting. But that's what you need. You need them to come together and work it out. Anyway, I don't see that happening. That's the only problem. This is a long frozen conflict that keeps warming back up and then getting back into some sort of stasis. And nobody seems to know how to solve it. In some sense, this is an interesting test for a new era of international diplomacy. Yeah. Trying to figure out how to work this stuff out. But so far, it's just, as these things go, so far it's just more violence, more pain drawn out.
I mean, but let's be honest, though. If we were having a conflict, let's say with another station, I don't know, and somebody comes and whispers in our ear and says, look, we got you, we're going to back you. Now, assuming that this person is powerful, assuming this person does have the capability to back us in the way that they're saying they back us, would that instigate us to push a little bit harder than what we would typically push in a negotiation? Well, the answer is, of course, yes. If, for example, the Israel-Palestine issue, and you have the United States that whole hog for Israel. It's not even pretending at this point. In the old days, it used to be, no, we're just a neutral arbiter in this process. And, of course, that was nonsense. We weren't a neutral arbiter. And that became that much more crass as we went through time. In fact, it's weird the way this stuff seems to get more overt. Like, back in the old days, if the Cuban Missile Crisis, go back and watch that video with Ronald Reagan, the Gipper, coming out and explaining the buck stops with me. All of this stuff had just become a known, and, I didn't know anything about it. I didn't realize we were selling weapons to our enemy in order to get money for another enemy that's on this side of the globe. But now, that stuff becomes almost understood and normal in the way that politics behaves. I'm saying it's weird the way that stuff becomes that much more overt as time goes on. Turkey is backing another power, just like the United States is backing Israel. And if the United States is backing Israel, is there any impetus for Israel to go to the peace tables? No, there's not. It's the secondary power that adds fuel to something that the world, for the most part, does not want fuel added to. And like we said before, this could go drastically bad. I mean, Turkey is apparently bringing terrorists from one sphere, where it was using terrorists, into another sphere. In this case now, Nagorno Karabakh. And then the question becomes, okay, what influence does Russia have in this? And we at Alexander McCurris was making the point that says, slowly, little green men will be added in to the mix in order to try to push back on this notion of you need to stop this hostilities. It's a fascinating conflict. Like you said, it's a frozen conflict. All sorts of weaponry and everything else is in that particular area. And these guys are killing each other actively at this point. And so is it like a typical fight where both sides get to the point of saying, okay, we can't make any more progress, in which case we're just frozen in the same way that we were frozen for the last X number of decades, only within another few decades to pop off again? No, there needs to be a solution. And like you said, the solution is probably going to be, I don't know, something that neither side is entirely happy with. But right now, I don't know what that solution is. And it doesn't necessarily seem that the two sides are, let's say, in the mood for that solution. And so this is a story we're going to follow. I've been fascinated by this ever since we've started covering this story. And we'll see. I mean, right now, yeah, Russia's trying to expend political leverage. They're trying to be peacemakers on this. And we'll see if it works. But right now, it just seems like chaos. Let's do this.
It absolutely does. You know what? We should go into a break. Yeah. We're taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
Yo! So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean? You're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in D.C. We are accepting calls. The segment 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. I was checking the latest on the Nagorno Karabakh thing, but basically it's the way we explained it. Peace talks are attempted. The United States apparently have gotten involved trying to get involved with peace talks. Yeah, I mean, it's a frozen struggle at this point. And frozen, I just mean frozen in fighting at this point. So we'll see how that goes. There's another story that we were having a conversation about. In fact, we were talking about this just before the election, but this gets into the politics of it all. Basically, yes. Yeah, let's do that. So let's go to, we have Tarif. Tarif, what's going on, Tarif?
Good morning, gentlemen. I want to expand on what I said yesterday dealing with the politics, about playing with the politics calls, dealing with single parent and whatnot. Okay, I think it's best it'd be a mixed blessing for those that's on the left, on progressives. If Trump win the House and the Senate, it'd be a mixed blessing for him because that means that DNC will be just void after that. They're just weak. They can't produce. They got rid of Bernie Sanders, and they had a chance and all that. And the best thing for the progressives to do is try to push every corporate Democrat out by replacing them with progressives, or maybe going third party. And y'all would actually pick up a sizable portion of the population that y'all can start with. It could be small, like 10% of the population, maybe 20%. But over time, y'all can build it up. And when 24, 28 come around, y'all can have a viable party that can push for, regulation of the banks like Glass-Steagall and things like that, which I don't think the Republicans are passed. But I know the left probably would. So just keep that in mind. Watch out for the false progressives running around here like we already know, like AOC and stuff like that. And Bernie Sanders is trying to fit in with the crowd. You don't want them. Y'all want progressives like Dennis Kucinich. Y'all want people to stand up, and fight for the people. You know what I'm saying?
Tarif, I agree with you. I agree with you. I mean, this is not the time to get weak lefties, like weak tea. No, this was 2020. I am perfectly clear. 2020 was that year that there should have been a break in, let's say, complicity or a break in allegiance from the standpoint of the left. I mean, for God's sake, you are in the midst of a Great Depression era event. I mean, you're talking about 200,000 people dead. You're talking about all these people in food banks trying to get food. You're talking about people being kicked out of their homes. We did this story yesterday. Shane did the story where there were like 10,000 people being evicted from their homes. That's just the beginning. And you have political actors who this seems to be an afterthought. And so it's like, from the standpoint of the left, what do you want to do? Do you want to appease the Democratic Party in allowing this level of homelessness, and allowing the number of evictions, and allowing this stuff to perpetuate itself? Or do you want to take a position? And do you want to stand for something? And what I mean by that is standing under the idea that this is the policy we're going to fight for, and this is the policy we're going to, if everything goes to pot, we're going to go to pot, grabbing onto this policy, trying to get this enacted. What do you think, Shane? I mean, Tarif has a point. Like, something has to take place in a consciousness of the left in dealing with politics. And it can't be just doing whatever it can to get whatever random Democrat elected. It really does have to go to this notion of this country is in need of certain items, and our job is to supply those items. And until you get there, I don't necessarily know how you get the changes in a society without people changing to get those changes.
I think that this is the cycle for that. I think that that's what a lot of people want to see, whether it's from the left or from the right or whatever. You want to see radical solutions. You want to see radical alternatives to the current political system and the way that things are going. And yeah, we're going to see that stuff. It's probably going to happen first and foremost with local politicians. And you'll have more AOC type candidates where you have an unexpected victory on a local level that, invigorates some change on the national level. That's I don't see how else it happens because, frankly, looking specifically at the Democrats, the DNC at the national level is powerful enough to suppress any genuine threat to the status quo. And so if you're going to have change, it's going to come in on the local level with a locally elected politician who then acts as a bellwether and leads the party in some other direction in the long run. The question is how that happens. But generationally, I think there's an argument that it does happen. Anyway, we've got another caller, but Jamarl, what's your take on that?
No, I think I agree with that. I mean, I think sometimes we get a perception of the world based on what happened, not necessarily what's possible. And in this very specific instance, we saw Sanders, like you said, the National Party being strong enough to basically squelch that, to destroy that. And so if anything happens, it may have to happen on the local level. It's either that or the person who's running on the national level is not trying to run in the interest of the party. He's trying to run in the interest of policy. And I'm saying those are different. That's all. And I don't know what that looks like, that last one looks like. Because Sanders, the guy who kind of did that, basically voted and wasn't fighting hard, let's say, in that race. He was just basically giving speeches. I would say this, though. You made the point before, making the point of saying, look, there may be something that has to take place that over time, where you get this kind of shift in the party. Well, it's possible that Sanders was a stone in that shift, but not necessarily the thing that brings it home. Moses looking over the thing. I may not get there with you, but, at the very least, I'm looking over the finish line. That type of stuff. So it's hard to figure out how this stuff comes out sometimes in regards to reality. But I think I agree with you overall. Tony from Kansas. Tony, what's going on?
Gentlemen, thanks for taking my call. I got to be honest, I am so nervous talking to you. Please bear with me. I've never made a phone call like this before. And I loved your show a long time ago, and I admire you guys. But I have to be honest, I believe in the next 3 days, we are going to experience the saddest day in American presidential political history. I firmly believe, if I can just explain, I firmly believe Rudy Giuliani has access to photographs that depict Hunter Biden having an affair with Joe Biden's granddaughter, and he will release them if Joe Biden refuses to withdraw from the race. And I believe Joe Biden knows this, and I believe Joe Biden is on a lid. He's staying in his house to contemplate what he can do about this circumstance, this situation. If he were to withdraw, he would destroy the Democrats' party, the Democrats' chances of any kind of successful election outcome. And if he stays in, Giuliani will release the photos and he will lose anyways. The question I'm wondering is Joe Biden loves his family. We know this from the diary recordings of Ashley, Joe Biden's daughter. And Ashley says that one time when she was talking to him about her personal problems, Joe Biden said, "You're making me cry, and I have to be giving a presidential debate coming up, and I have to be thinking about your problems." And I sincerely believe Joe loves his family. However, Hunter Biden's crack addiction has truly gone too far, and it has destroyed this situation.
Well, Tony, just because Hunter Biden may have a crack addiction, the issue is, what does that have to do with Biden? And more importantly, are the documents real? This is kind of why I say what's more important than anything else is not the weird way in which the documents got to where they got to. That's not, people can hand off stuff. In my head, they didn't want their fingerprints on it. That's the way I was looking at it. But more importantly, is it real? Like, you may have images of Hunter Biden. You may have pictures of Hunter Biden doing crack. You may have him, in some kind of affair or whatever. You may have all that stuff. And those things can be there to legitimize the documents themselves. But whether the documents are real or not are secondary. That's unknown. And the media doesn't want to ask the question. The media is basically playing hide and seek and blocking for Biden, where he barely brings this up or answers himself. Think back to the debate. In the last presidential debate, Trump kept bringing this up, and the moderator kept pulling away from it. She didn't want to touch it. And it's the same thing. They don't want Biden to have to engage this stuff. So I don't know if, Giuliani has the goods. And whether or not Giuliani has the goods, Giuliani is probably going to still say he does, which is the problem. Like, we don't know the reality of what's true and what's false in this. And so, Tony, I feel where you're coming from, but I would say this is one of those things where you just kind of wait and see what takes place. What do you think, Shane? You think Giuliani has the goods, or you think this is somewhat of a bluff for kind of a last-minute presidential vote poll?
I don't know. And you're asking the question. I would ask the question, what are the goods even? We don't heckin' know. We know what we know from looking at the videos specifically. That there is something there from the emails that have come out in the last couple of weeks that the New York Post has released. Biden hasn't denied it, and of course that's the first thing that they would do if these were false. There's the other argument here, which is the Streisand effect, where if with the social media companies, as they try to shut it down, they're actually bringing more attention to it. You could see the same thing potentially applied to Biden. If he responds to it, then he's bringing more attention to it. But frankly, this is legal. And like Lee was saying the other day, if this were false, if this were, if these emails were fabricated, if the media that they're talking about, that they've started to release, was like a deep fake or whatever, Biden would just sue. Biden would just sue and shut it down, and he'd have a great case for that. But the fact that he's not is indicative. Now, that's separate from the question of what Giuliani has that he hasn't yet revealed. And you don't know exactly where that's going to go. But the fact that he has revealed, the fact that so far what's come out seems to have been true, means that probably what he has, there's some element of truth to it too. Now, the accusations of incest, that's an interesting one. I'd seen this coming out, and it was something like one third of the photos, sort of prurient photos that Hunter Biden had on the laptop, had to do with a member of the Biden family, with an underage member of the Biden family. But those are sort of rumors coming out right now. We don't, nobody has, and frankly, nobody should want to see. Nobody has seen, and nobody should want to see this stuff. We don't know where it's going to go. I don't know. We've got to close it out, but any last takes before we go into our break tomorrow?
I mean, you're right. That would be lethal if that came out and it was true. I think what people need to have a certain degree of skepticism, I suppose. I mean, the documents themselves logically follow. I mean, he's head of a company of Burisma. We know the company is corrupt. We know he was getting money from it. It matches. The question becomes the other stuff. And that's the stuff I think you're saying. That stuff is lethal, and that stuff is disgusting if it's legit. So let's do this. Let's take a break. We'll be back with headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news. Oh, and by the way, before getting to the headlines, I just want to make sure that people understand the validity of that laptop. We don't know. Even if stuff comes out and it sounds like it could be right or not, we still don't know. And I will leave that as an open question about the legitimacy of it. I would say Biden not responding to it is one thing, but that is not necessarily indicative of it being flat fact true. And just keep both in your head at the same time. Let's go to the headlines. In the news, Spain says 355,000 more people were left unemployed in the third quarter, bringing the total jobless rate up to 16.3% from 15.3% in the previous 3-month period, as surging infections and new virus restrictions hurt economic development. The National Statistics Institute said Tuesday that the total number of people out of work now in Spain stood at 3.7 million. Some 1 million people lost their jobs in the second quarter as the effects of the lockdown during the first viral wave crippled the economy. Protests took place across Italy on Monday over new restrictions to curb the country's second wave of COVID-19. Clashes were reported in the northern cities of Milan and Turin, where petrol bombs were thrown at officers. In Milan, tear gas was used to disperse protesters, and thousands of people gathered in the center of Naples. The demonstration began soon after the national government order to close restaurants, bars, and cinemas came into effect at 1800 local time. That is amazing. Shane, what do you think about this? Because, for the most part, I need to check Europe's numbers, but if I remember correctly, these guys, they're not near us. I mean, they were bad. They looked like they had their waves, but it looked like the wave was going down. Now, at this point, it looks like it's kind of flaring up, and the government is trying to take action to curb it. The population, or element of the population, clears against this. How do you frame this when you're looking at this? I mean, I see part of it as, yeah, there are going to be some people who don't necessarily want to be locked down. Fair enough. But petrol bombs, I mean, this seems like it's escalating.
It probably is. And it's probably not just a response surely to the lockdown, but also to the government's mishandling of this. And this would have been a lockdown that, followed Italy as the epicenter in Europe of deaths from COVID. So it's not just the fact that you're going through another lockdown. It's also the fact that it was bungled so poorly from the beginning by all appearances. So it didn't even work. I guess that's the point there. It's a lot more easy for people to get frustrated about a draconian policy, at least one that's perceived as such, if that policy doesn't even have the effect that it was intended to have. So that's one way to look at it. But I'm not in Italy. I'm not protesting this stuff, so I don't want to misrepresent there.
No, I understand, but that does make sense, right? It seems like they initially were slammed by this. I mean, one of the worst spots in Europe, and now they're hitting a second wave. And like you said, the public is frustrated. It's the worst of both worlds. Not only did it not work, meaning all these people died because of the way it was bungled, but then you have the secondary effect of lockdowns on top of it not working prior. It's just a weird mix between the two. That's unfortunate. Italy, yeah. I loved Italy when I was there. And so it's unfortunate to see these places coming to grips like this. I think the other part of this that's interesting is that the protocols that are being put in place are being put in place because of people dying. And Italy knows, meaning they have a very clear understanding of how this looks when things get bad and the hospitals are slammed and the hospitals can't compensate and so forth. And yet you still get this, a large number of people coming out. I wonder what's the percentages in the country regarding the number of people who are for it and against it. Like in the United States, you have, I think it was like almost 60%, like 55% was okay with the national mask ban. I mean, a national mask mandate. I am not even for that. And I've been on this channel arguing for masks, from day one. But the public in this country has a very clear idea of what it wants. That still doesn't stop you from getting a few thousand people that may show up for a rally. So I'm wondering, and I suspect that you may get a large section of the population that is very terrified of that virus, and you may get another vocal part that's not. And I think that's might be what you're seeing here. Like you said, the worst of both worlds. Let's go to the next one. According to various reports, President Trump plans to announce an initiative to issue early vaccines for COVID-19 free of cost to recipients of Medicare and Medicaid. The administration is expected to announce a plan to cover vaccines that receive emergency and authorization from Food and Drug Administration. The change could help millions receive a COVID vaccine for free. The United States reported more than 74,300 new cases of coronavirus on Monday, pushing the country's daily average over the past week to above 71,000, the most in any 7-day stretch of the pandemic. And we know at this point that immediately follows spikes, or a spike in deaths. They seem to come back to back in this way. Election day is just 1 week away. More than 59 million total ballots cast as of Monday morning suggested a record turnout for this year's race compared to the 47.2 million early votes cast in 2016 election, according to data from the United States Election Project. The number of early ballots cast so far represents 43.1% of the total national turnout in 2016. That number is astonishing. Let me repeat that, because I think we need to grasp that. The numbers for early voting, right here, the number of early ballots cast so far represents 43.1% of the total national turnout for 2016. Meaning people are rushing to the polls. The question is, what does it mean? I mean, usually when you have a huge number of people going to the polls like that, that's usually beneficial for the Democrat. But, I mean, does that ring true this time around? And it seems that the focus on this race has been on Trump, and if you're having that many people going to the polls. For example, early voting in battleground states, 18 to 29. In 2016, there were 44,107 early voters in Florida. This number in 2020 is 257,720. This is in Florida. In North Carolina, early voting, 2016, 25,150. 2020, 204,986. And for Michigan, early voting, 2016, 7,572. In 2020, 18 to 29 range, 145,201. It is not even close. It's not even close. And I have to be honest, if your name is Donald Trump right now, you should be feeling some kind of way. What do you think, Shane? Personally, I think this is to the detriment of Trump. I don't think numbers on this scale are positive to any Republican under normal circumstances. But definitely in these battleground states, it doesn't necessarily seem that these people are rushing to the polls for Trump. I could be wrong. What do you think?
We'll see. I mean, here's the wider take, though. Whichever way it goes, we have this set up to be a contested election. So Trump has been talking about voter fraud for weeks now. We'll see how actively he contests that, assuming for a second that he loses. But yeah, that can get really ugly. And again, if it goes to the Supreme Court, they have a Republican, they have a conservative majority on the court. They potentially have what they need to get him back in. And, I don't see the Democrats accepting that, of course. Not that he would necessarily push it there. In fact, I don't think that he would, but he could. And that's what's worrying for a lot of people here. Yeah. So it's the back and the forth, it's like the call and the response of it that could get pretty frightening. Anyway, that's my take. Jamarl, what's yours?
Since it's not custom for us. That's not normal for the United States. And because it's not normal, usually you have the candidates come out, they shake hands, this is the new guy, this guy won, et cetera, et cetera. And you may not get that. In fact, not just not get that. You may have the situation where the Supreme Court basically steps in to install using Donald Trump's own pick to be the final vote. Can you imagine that? That would be astonishing if that happened. Also, on a secondary point, I don't see how Trump wins this race. I don't know what America looks like if you can have 220,000 people dead and still end up winning the presidential election. I don't know what that world looks like. And look, it's possible. It's possible. Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee, right?
It is, yeah. And I mean, the other side here is you don't have a sliding door to look at the other parallel universe that could have happened if Hillary had been president from 2016 to 2020. So for a lot of people, it's like, okay, well, how well would the DNC, would the Democrats have handled this really? Did Trump actually do that poorly? I bet that there are people who are asking themselves that. So that's one thing. And then, of course, another thing is it's not necessarily for a lot of people looking back, although that's where the evidence is. It's looking forward. Who would you rather have for the next 4 years to deal with this and other crises? Would you rather have Biden or would you rather have Trump? Very simply. And even though Trump has made mistakes, when you combine that with the other thing, well, how well would Hillary, how well would the Democrats have done at solving this problem? When you put those two together, there are probably quite a few people who are going to be voting Trump. It's just, well, of course, whether or not they're a majority. It's whether or not that's going to matter in the cycle and the electoral college and everything. Anyway.
And by the way, that is a really good point. I mean, the sliding door. We don't know the alternative. I mean, basically, you're stuck with people just kind of assuming this person would have done better or this person would have done worse. But as a flat fact, you don't know. The other thing that's interesting is the virus is expected to go into like 2021. I mean, they're expecting a hellish winter with all sorts of problems and those numbers increasing. Meaning, even if Biden won, under the best case scenario, you still have this seemingly going further into the spring of next year. So this is not, good any way you cut it. Judge Amy Coney Barrett, conservative appeals court judge and protege of the former Justice Antonin Scalia, was confirmed on Monday to the Supreme Court. Republicans overcame unanimous Democratic opposition to make Judge Barrett the 115th Justice of the Supreme Court and the fifth woman. The vote, 52-48, with all but one Republican senator, Susan Collins of Maine, who is battling a re-election, ended up supporting or backing Democrats to not vote for her. It was the first time in 151 years that a justice was confirmed without the support of a single member of the minority party. Vice President Joe Biden on Monday night slammed the quote-unquote rushed and unprecedented confirmation of Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Biden issued the condemnation in a lengthy statement released shortly after Barrett was officially sworn into the nation's highest court. Quote, the rushed and unprecedented confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett as Associate Justice to the Supreme Court in the middle of an ongoing election should be a stark reminder to every American that your vote matters, unquote, the Democratic presidential candidate said. Barrett, the fifth female justice on the court's history, will begin hearing cases immediately. I bet she will. I bet she will. Around 10,000 people in Bangladesh rallied in the South Asian nation's capital on Tuesday to protest France's president and his staunch support of secular laws that deem caricatures depicting the Prophet Muhammad as protected under freedom of speech. Protesters from the conservative Islami Andalan Bangladesh group, which supports the introduction of blasphemy laws in the Muslim-majority country, carried banners and placards reading, quote, all Muslims of the world unite and boycott France, unquote. It was the largest protest yet against the cartoon in recent days. Some carried portraits of French President Emmanuel Macron with X on his face. One protester carried a cutout image of the French president with shoes around his neck as a sign of insult. Now, we kind of carried the story yesterday, even though this is the extension of the story. Let me say this. This is Fault Lines. You've been listening to Headlines, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I wanted to talk about that story yesterday, and we didn't get the opportunity to do so. Basically, Emmanuel Macron is basically saying the most rational thing in the world, to live in a country that is secular. Meaning, yes, we can have this image of your prophet, and we can lampoon that image. Everything is up for grabs in our society to lampoon, including your religious imagery. Now, that's just part and parcel to being a government that is under a constitution and not necessarily under God. So I was interested. I was interested in the story just from the response of the people in France. Meaning, if you're in France, you can't acquiesce. to this. You have to take the position that free speech laws matter more. It's 8:15. I want to get your take on this. So let's do this. When we get the opportunity to talk at 9, let's bring this one up again if we get the chance. But I'm going to say this is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, talking with him for this segment. He's a speaker, author, and rabbi. You can watch his videos on YouTube at True Torah Jews. Also check out his website, truetorahjews.org. Rabbi Shapiro, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. How are you guys doing down there in Washington, D.C.?
Decent. I'm on the West Coast at this point. Our station is in Washington, D.C., and I don't blame you for pinning me there. But a couple hours earlier. In any event, Rabbi, thank you for joining us. We're talking about a couple of things here. I'll just start with this. Jews for Trump, a recent fiery protest back and forth in Manhattan between a group of protesters and a group of Jews who are voting for Trump, were driving in a caravan, and this kind of blew up in a sort of local sense. I'll just start here. What was your take on this? And what is more broadly in the Jewish community, what is the sort of support calculus here, looking at Biden, looking at Trump in the 2020 election cycle?
Okay, so first, as far as the Jews for Trump and that rally, this is like a small subset of a subset of a subset of people, a bunch of Trump supporters who are Jews that got together and decided we're going to make an organization called Jews for Trump. And they did it. Nobody has a copyright on the term Jews, so they just did it. They're just like, they're so insignificant, these people, that, they're a group like anybody else, you know. They made a protest, they got a permit, and that was it. And there were other people, probably a very insignificant group of people that didn't like what these guys were doing, and they started a fight. Big deal. It's not the worst fight that probably broke out in Manhattan that day, and nor the most significant. However, because it's a presidential election year, and the Jews are perceived, wrongfully, by the way, as a homogeneous community, it reflects on the Jews in general, and that was the purpose of such a event, to make believe, to pretend, to portray the Jews as a whole as voting for Trump. Now, as far as your question regarding the Jewish community's support for Trump, well, Jews mostly, approximately, I would guess about 3/4 of them, or 70% of them, are going to vote for Biden. They always vote Democrat, most of the Jews. However, the more religious Jews, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, tends to vote for the more conservative candidate. It's basically like everywhere. Judaism is a religion. The more Democratic one, the more leftist ones vote more left-wing, and the more right-wing conservative ones vote more right-wing. Jews per se are on neither end of the spectrum because they are Jews. They are religious Jews, and because of that, they vote for the party that supports religion more. So it would be, let's say, tax vouchers for not-for-profit schools or private schools or things like that. Now, the thing over here that's important, that's unusual, that has never happened before, that's unprecedented, is that this whole idea of the Orthodox Jews in New York that you mentioned to me when we were speaking earlier, or the producer did, about the protests that they're making. There's a new factor over here, and it's complicated. On the day before the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, a few weeks ago, Governor Cuomo played on the air a robocall, which was really a WhatsApp message, of a ultra-Orthodox Jew, a Trump supporter, that said in the robocall, please everybody, make this go viral. We just spoke to the Trump campaign, and the Trump campaign asked us to make sure that people bring signs to the protest that we're about to make that says, Cuomo kills thousands. Cuomo actually played this on the air. It was very embarrassing for whoever this guy was. And what's happening is that because the ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Orthodox Jews are to a large extent, a conservative constituent group within New York, which is a liberal state, and their lifestyle is being disrupted because of COVID, of course, like everybody else's, but even more so because our lifestyle involves a lot of mass gatherings. We have many weddings and funerals and it's the synagogue 3 times a day, and on Saturdays and holidays much longer. We stay there much longer amount of time than we do during the week. So it's being disrupted to a tremendous degree. And the schools are vital to our existence philosophically, religiously. Schooling, education is a fundamental of Jewish religion. So the fact that the schools have to close is very painful to us. And yes, there is a virus and we have to do all these things, but we are a community in distress, okay? And we're a community in distress. An outlier in the New York liberal democratic community, democratic voting population. And what there was a campaign, an active campaign coming from the Trump campaign and some very, very hardcore Trump supporters amongst the Jews to make a strategy that goes like this. Portray Cuomo and de Blasio as making chaos and anti-Semitic and oppressing the Jewish community, that they are discriminating against them, and protest against them, protest against their lockdowns and all their methodologies, and at the other hand say the only solution we have to the chaos that's going on in this democratic state, this anti-Semitic chaos, is Trump. Please, everybody, vote for Trump, because otherwise we're going to have chaos and disruption. And the Jewish community, the ultra-Orthodox community, especially in New York, has been bombarded with propaganda messages, subliminal and blatant, to this effect: you are being oppressed. They are anti-Semites. Now, most of the people don't go for this nonsense, but there are hardcore, mostly kids. Listen, every community has people who are susceptible to propaganda who are going for this. And especially the major Trump supporters are telling people what to think. And they're telling them, especially since Jews are kind of very sensitive to anti-Semitism, right? Especially the last few years when it's been rising. Anti-Semitism is rising, and this is just a manifestation of it. They want to take away your religious rights. So they have the paranoia of the right-wing idea that everybody who wants the people who want to lock down New York are really just want to destroy Trump. They want to ruin the economy to show Trump is bad, and they're anti-Semitic because they're closing your synagogues and your schools. And Also, anti-Semitism, you have to fight back against anti-Semitism. That's a Zionist credo. You have to fight back against it. Don't negotiate. Don't fight back. Protest. Don't let them cart you off to the concentration camps again. So you have the perfect storm where professional propagandists, both from the Trump campaign, and there's one more place over here that's very important that's doing this, is targeting the Jewish community with a tremendous amount of propaganda, a tremendous amount of money in this. Now, one more thing. In the year 2018, the very powerful Israeli think tank, in English, the JPPI, Jewish Public Policy Institute, for the government of Israel, was studying how in America Israel is losing support. First of all, this idea about you need Israel to prevent another Holocaust is kind of fading into history because people aren't afraid of Holocausts now, even though some people are trying to make us do so. But people are not afraid of Holocausts. 25-year-old now, his grandfather knew about the Holocaust. He grew up in America. I almost never experienced anti-Semitism, certainly not violent anti-Semitism ever. Anti-Semitism, yeah, but not violent anti-Semitism. Most people in America is like that. So in America, and especially because of a lot of Israel's actions also, a lot of Jews, especially left-wing liberal Jews, are not supporting Israel anymore. And they did a study to figure out how to get American Jews long-term to support Israel more. So they figure like this. Number one, focus on those people whose Jewish identity is strong and who are expanding the groups that are the future of Judaism in America, namely the Orthodox Jews. Okay? How do we get the Orthodox Jews to support Israel, which is especially right now the right-wing Israel, right? So here's their plan. They said, well, Orthodox Jews are interested mostly in their religion. Other than that, they're regular people. We're regular Americans, but we have a religion, Judaism. No, change that. Get the Orthodox Jews involved in national politics. Get them involved in national politics. That's step one to get them involved with Zionism and supporting of Israel, because Israel is just a political thing. It's not religious, and Orthodox Jews know that. But get Orthodox Jews involved in national politics. Get them more involved in politics than they were. Get them to look at their Jewishness as having to do with politics. Propagandize them, indoctrinate them. Do what you can to get the Jews involved with national politics. So in the last few years, there are these Orthodox Jews, Zionists, big-time hardcore Zionists that have created these right-wing, supposedly, organizations of supposedly for Jewish values, religion, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, things like that. But really, they're Zionist organizations, and they're major Trump supporters, these people. And they approach the Jewish people and they say, look, we're going to protect you from anti-Jewish legislation, anti-religious legislation. We're going to do that. We're going to protect your religious rights. Support us. When really their hidden agenda is to support Zionism and so there are Orthodox Jews who fall for this. Thank God it's a very small amount, but they make a lot of noise. And the strategy, just like all other politicians use this, is to portray the Jewish community. Oh, the Jews are all supporting Trump. Let's make a lot of noise. Let's use Trump flags. The Jews are supporting Trump. The Jews are supporting Trump. The Jews hate de Blasio, and they hate Cuomo, and they hate New York, and it's chaos in New York. And the only one that's going to save New York is Trump. Please, Trump, help us. And especially since Trump campaign wants to portray him as the law and order candidate, meaning without him, everybody's going to riot and blow up the country. So that dovetails perfectly with this campaign to get the Jews to express this attitude in New York. And really all the Jews are expressing, all the Jews, that the thing that's driving this is the distress of the Jews that we can't live our normal communal life. So they're doing
that. So it sounds like the lockdown. We've got to close out here, but it sounds like the lockdown is coming together, a confluence, if you will, with fears of anti-Semitic prosecutions by the wider culture over the last couple of years. And it sounds like propaganda, like you're saying, being used in a sort of fear-mongering attempt to get people to vote for Trump. We've got to close it out there, though. Rabbi Shapiro, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
We're going into a break. We're going to be back on the other side of this break, talking with Michael Maloof about U.S.-Iranian relations and more after the election. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us for this particular segment is Michael Maloof, former Senior Security Policy Analyst in the Office of Secretary of Defense, author and regular contributing analyst on RT and other media outlets. He has nearly 30 years of federal service in the U.S. Department of Defense. Michael, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we're going to get into questions on the Iranian tensions in the United States and what's to be expected after the race. But before we start off, something took place over the weekend with the signing, basically bringing on Sudan to the list of countries that are going to be, let's say, in a alliance with Israel, or at the very least normalized relations with Israel. This joins Bahrain and Qatar as the other two. There's a question about Saudi Arabia, even though it's understood that Israel, especially on a top level, works with Saudi Arabia and the United States into areas of the Middle East. So the question becomes, what is the impetus here? Is this for the protection of Israel, or is this, let's say, for aggression towards Iran? I guess what I'm asking is, what is the point of bringing these countries together in this kind of normalized relation with the other countries in the Middle East?
Right. Well, there seems to be two strategies working here. I might add that parenthetically that in addition to Bahrain and UAE, Jordan and Egypt have had relations with Israel for years. So these are other Arab countries. What you're talking about now would be the GCC, or the Gulf Cooperating Countries, which would be coming on eventually. Sudan is not a GCC country, but it is Muslim, and so this is significant. I think that what you're going to be, there's two points here I'd like to make. Number one, this is part of a concerted U.S. strategy to basically ease out of the Middle East in terms of its physical presence and let Israel take over the security in that region. And to do that would be to team up with, to normalize relations with these other countries, using as a common thread anti-Iranian point of view. Now, some of these countries have relations with Iran, but they also, this agreement, an understanding comes with dramatic sweeteners by the United States that gives them encouragement. And also Israel, which is a net exporting country, wants to sell its technology, and these countries want that kind of Western technology. and also trade. So they're willing to put aside the continuing differences that center around the Palestinian issue in order to move on. Some countries, such as Saudi Arabia, as you pointed out, had not yet signed on. However, excuse me, these countries which have signed on and have gone along with this agreement have gotten their blessing from the Saudis. So that means that in time, the Saudis may come on board. Now, the Saudis have another problem. They view themselves as the spokesman for the Sunni Islam world and the leadership in that region. And some other countries Muslim countries are beginning to bulk, particularly Pakistan, and in terms of the diplomatic recognition of Israel. So Saudi Arabia is trying to ease in a way that it doesn't rupture its ongoing relationships with such countries as Pakistan. There are Muslim countries which are hostile still to that idea. So it's just a question of time, which then raises.
And it's not just this. Moving closer to Israel for countries in the region. That's not just controversial for the rulership class. That's not just controversial for the elites. It's apparently massively controversial for a vast swath of the population. It seems like, to me, for some lasting diplomatic armistice, some lasting diplomatic peace, and for the U.S. to basically effectively be able to move out of the region, leaving Israel as the local arbiter of affairs in some sense, you need a resolution of the Palestinian problem. You need the occupation in Palestine to end or be legitimated in some way, just to look at it in a realpolitik sense. Michael, do you see any signs of that happening? What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, what you just said is absolutely correct, and that is an unresolved problem. But the further problem is that even though these countries in the past have voiced support for the Palestinians, as a practical matter, they've done very little. They don't provide money or help to these refugees that are stuck in squalid camps in Jordan and in Lebanon. I mean, I've seen it myself for years, and it's despicable. And then on top of that, they were flooded in with other refugees, other Palestinians coming in from Syria when the civil war broke out. I mean, it's a mess, and no one wants to talk about that. And yet, the Trump peace plan doesn't seem to address the problem with the issue with the Palestinians, because they basically gutted whatever notion of a two-state resolution there was. So at this point, and unless the Israelis and the Palestinians can come together with some resolution, the problem is going to simmer, and this is going to reignite down the line. And I don't know that these agreements, these diplomatic agreements, are very lasting. I think it's going to depend on conditions and circumstances. But if a resolution can be worked out with the Palestinians, that's fine. But so far, no one has come forward with a viable plan that's acceptable to both sides.
Yeah, it seems to be optics, meaning it seems to kind of it seems to be they're giving voice to Palestinians without necessarily giving material support. And it seems that the governments themselves, in their allegiance with Israel, almost as if it makes the Palestinian issue seems less relevant. But I don't think their populations think in this term. And just to be specific, earlier on I said Qatar. The UAE was, I meant the UAE. UAE is the accurate answer for it. So there's that. But beyond this point, it seems like it's more optics. And it seems like the upper echelon of the government, or the people within these governments, care about that issue less, despite having to give lip service to that issue. You made the point that this seems to be short term. The one with Sudan for the moment, to delve into that. Sudan is in a new transition government after being basically under a strong man for several decades. So this is a change. I mean, for the longest time, Sudan was one of the countries that was, most vocal in that war against Israel, the Arab-Israeli war. And so it's a turn for these guys to turn around and say, okay, now we're going to create some kind of diplomatic allegiance or diplomatic association with Israel. From the standpoint of the populations in Sudan themselves and this new president, the population, is it for or against this? If I'm understanding, there were protests against this. And so how is the transition government squaring this? Is this just an indication that the government is moving closer to the West in its thinking?
Well, I think they see their future in the West rather than having the continued turmoil. And there are, again, with the deal came sweeteners, and even though they're getting off the terrorism list in the U.S., which is in their eyes a big deal, and it means that it opens up trade opportunities, whereas there were sanctions in place before from other countries. When countries and people go on that sanctions list, it has a worldwide reverberation. So and I have friends who are on the sanctions list right now from Iran, and they have really felt it, and it cuts across nation state borders. So it's as long as the U.S. Western financial system is dominant, it will prevail, and it will continue to prevail until there are changes in an alternative world order, and that seems to be where things are also heading. But that aside, the thing with Sudan is that they also have to pay a certain amount of money in exchange to terrorist victims, and that's part of the deal coming from Sudan, and apparently Sudan has agreed to do that. So that gets them off the terrorist list and opens up their opportunities. And so Sudan wants to clearly put its stock now in the Western side, and if having relations with Israel is part of it, then that opens up other opportunities for them as well. And
Michael, we've got a couple of minutes. Go for it.
They really got their signal from the fact that Saudi Arabia has not objected, and other Arab countries themselves and Muslim countries themselves are doing it. So they probably felt a little easier in making that decision.
And this comes as the United States is not just trying to move out of the Middle East, but also trying to reassert itself as a diplomatic power. As such, sort of on the tail of a Trump term, after a couple of years, covering a period during which many international observers were concerned that the United States would basically permanently recede from the international arena. And some people were excited, not just saying that, people were concerned. Some people were excited about that prospect too, with the United States obviously acting as a policeman of the world for decades now. Frankly, there's something to be excited about there. But, I want to go into an early break. When we come back, I'd like to get into the issue of sanctions. You just started to talk about that. I'd like to hear from you about how sanctions, in a weird way, might threaten the international financial institutions and political institutions, which are supposed to be imbued with attributes of impartiality. If we're using them for partisan political purposes, what does that do to them in the long run? Does that ruin them in the same way that corruption ruins the legitimacy of the laws? How does that affect the sort of international arena? Where does that leave us? On the other side of a U.S. unipolar world order, we're joined by Michael Maloof, having an interesting conversation for those listening. Michael is a former senior security policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, also an author and a regular contributing analyst on RT. Nearly 30 years of federal service in the DoD. We'll be back with him on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Michael Maloof. Michael, for those listening, is a former senior security policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He's also an author, regular contributing analyst on RT and other media outlets. And he comes to us with nearly 30 years of federal service in the United States Department of Defense. That's the DOD for you folks. Michael, thank you again for being with us. I'm curious, how do you think, we're talking about sanctions, specifically in light of Iran, but the United States has relied on sanctions in large part, other than coups overseas, as its sort of main diplomatic wedge that it tries to drive into situations against other nations, try to, get concessions on different grounds. I guess where I'm going with this, and what I'd like to hear your take on, we could go in a couple different directions here, but is, those sanctions are effective because they take place under the umbrella, under the aegis, with the enforcement of certain international institutions, which are ostensibly impartial. They're supposed to be objective in some sense. They're supposed to at least not just do what the United States wants them to do, but act as true mediators in international affairs. And this even applies to the banking system, the international banking and financial system. Which again, if you want money, which countries do and people do, you need that money to be sound in some sense and dependent on objective grounds that aren't going to be swayed in the short run or the long run by the political interests of any one state. Our sanctions seem to cut against that. Michael, is there any element of truth in this? Where do you think that this goes in the long run?
Well, I think your economic system has been weaponized and has become a political weapon of use out of concern that there is this alternative world order being looked at very, very seriously by the East. That would include China, Russia, even now Turkey, if you will, and Iran. And all countries that belong to the Shanghai cooperating countries, the SCO as it's called, and it's as long as countries are abiding by the Western financial system, and even the Russian ruble is pegged to the U.S. dollar. As long as the dollar is the so-called quote world currency end quote, they're going to be able to be manipulated politically. And the Trump administration has particularly used sanctions, not against its so-called adversaries, but even against its friends, which was rather incredible. And that has actually prompted a number of Western allies to begin to look eastward to get out from under that, especially if Trump is reelected. So that's going to make for an interesting time. I think that we're seeing countries such as Russia and China, faced with sanctions on themselves already, are getting to the point now where they can't be sanctioned anymore, and as a result, they're just ignoring them. And especially when it comes to trading with Iran, and they're just basically going to skirt around those U.S. sanctions because there's nothing more to be sanctioned, and they're just going to be going. They're just going to continue and try to build up on this notion of this alternative world order and begin to trade increasingly in their own currencies and not be pegged to any particular currency, even though the Chinese yuan may be a possibility. But I think for now, countries are prepared to trade in their own currencies and get out from under the dependency of the U.S. dollar, as long as they're trading eastward. If they have to trade with the West, with the EU, then you have the you have the euro currency and the dollar that they have to contend with, and I think they want to pull away from that. I think what's happened as a result of sanctions, even on Western companies, particularly in the EU, that Trump has initiated for trading with Iran, and also countries that want to contribute to, let's say, the defense programs in Russia, which is by law, U.S. law, a basis for sanctions, even on those companies. Then they're going to be looking more toward doing something alternatively, and that is now to look for this alternative world order. And I think we're going to see that develop more and more, especially if Trump gets reelected. I think the notion, what happened back in May of 2018 when Trump dropped out of the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear agreement, that was a watershed moment. And I think that was a wake-up call to countries, Eastern countries, that they've got to do something alternatively. Here, Iran was in full compliance at the time with that agreement, and notwithstanding the fact that they had agreements and were in compliance, the U.S. broke it, and which is going to send messages. Even if Biden were to be elected, it's really going to have an impact for years to come on whether other countries really want to enter into any long-term agreements with the United States. And if Biden were to be elected, and if he wants to try to work on the JCPOA, it's going to. I think there's going to be problems from the Iranian side of trust, and that also goes for other countries.
And legitimately so, by the way. I mean, the missile treaties we pulled out from Russia, maybe putting weapons in space. I mean, Trump went so far as to call it Space Force. The agreements didn't seem to matter. When those agreements became inconvenient for one of the presidents, this idea that the treaties or whatever, that it seemed to be secondary.
Well, you got New START coming up, New START treaty with Russia, and the United States in principle, under the Trump administration, has agreed in principle to work with them on it. Under Bolton, all agreements were, any arms reduction agreements with any, especially with Russia, when Bolton was the national security advisor, that had an extraordinarily damaging impact. And we're still seeing the remnants of neocons within the Trump administration, such as Pompeo and Pence, who want to perpetuate this notion of being a hard line toward Russia and especially toward China, and that's had ramifications. Even if Biden gets in, these countries are not going to trust working with the U.S. And the signals I'm receiving is that whether it's Trump or Biden who get into office come January the 20th, Russia is not going to trust working with the U.S. and it's going to be a very, very difficult time in terms of the relationship between the two countries.
And I can't blame them. Why would they? I mean, this is, in an interesting way, this ties back into the election cycle, obviously. The intense and increasing polarization is like a pendulum that seems to be pushing the U.S. into more and more volatility internationally, where from a foreign policy perspective, you can't blame other countries for not wanting to work with us because, frankly, they don't know how to work with us. Because one president gets elected, we want to maintain our position. Another president gets elected, we want to pull back or change in different ways. And even within the Trump administration, obviously, like you're saying, the vice president and the secretary of state, two hardliners on military issues. It's ongoing. On the other side of the election, what do you think it would take, and what kind of, more broadly, what role would the United States be able to reasonably assume in the long run in an international order, and what political changes do you see as necessary for making that happen in a sort of stable, healthy, sane sense internationally, Michael?
Oh, you want a perfect world. I think it really depends on who's going to get elected. This country will go in different directions, clearly. if Trump gets reelected, there will be the continued animosity with NATO and also with Turkey. Probably more tolerance of Turkey. If Biden gets in, given the relationship that Biden has with Erdogan, it's going to really, that could have the effect of creating a greater schism within NATO because Erdogan and Biden do not get along. And as a consequence, Turkey may look more increasingly eastward, which benefits the Russian perspective of trying to drive a wedge into NATO and breaking it up once and for all. It's still an alliance looking for a new identity in light of the end of the Cold War. It's still floundering around and wants now to do space stuff. It's just groping around to find some notion of unity and trying to keep the U.S. engaged in it. It has been talking, of course, about creating its own alliance for its own protection. But as Trump points out, it's a country, an alliance, and especially Germany, that wants to want billions of dollars to protect against Russia, but yet it's willing to do extensive petroleum trade with Russia. So it raises a lot of questions on just what role these countries that belong to NATO, what direction they really want to go. And it raises the issue of whether the alliance is really relevant any longer. If countries want to foster better relations with Russia, hopefully the United States will want to do as well. I envision that Biden, if he is elected, will basically have very poor relations with Russia. And Trump, I think, may, even though he's imposed a lot of sanctions, may want to ease up on him and may want to work with Vladimir Putin because he'll be a lame duck and he won't have anything to lose. And notwithstanding the charges of collusion, he's going to move forward because he feels that he needs to, that there are areas of cooperation that we really do need to work with Russia on. And I believe that is the case. And we're not going to be doing it if we continuously have these hostile relationships between the two countries. Biden will have more of a closer tie with China, certainly, but the United States will have far less of one under Trump. So, because so as I say, that it depends upon who's going to get elected, and and everybody right now in the world is holding their breath, and no one knows which way it's going to go. And come November the 3rd, I doubt on that day that we will really know what the outcome is unless there's a sweep by one side or the other. And that's going to be a big question mark until then.
Michael, we have about a minute and a half left remaining. I'm curious, what do you think is going to take place in November in the election? I'm putting you on the spot. We're going to get a prognostication out of you. From the standpoint of your perspective on this, what does this look like it's going to go, and what is going to happen right after? Meaning, what do you have in mind in regards to the consequences of a potential contested election?
Well, if there's a contested election, it's going to take months. It could go into, and that's why Trump wants to get this Supreme Court appointment in, and so they'd have 9 instead of 8, because inevitably there will be court challenges. We're already seeing there are court challenges now, and in fact, the Supreme Court even now is ruling on certain election-related cases from the states, and this is going to even perpetuate itself more as we hear the results coming from states, especially if they are extremely close, within like less than 1% or something. That's going to be
contested,
and we don't get the results. We don't get the results on 3 November. So it's going to be a ticklish time, and it's going to create greater tensions. 30. And it depends upon who's going to win. If Trump looks like he's in the lead, we're going to see a greater internal disorder, I'm afraid.
I have to cut you off here. I thank you. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I always enjoy these conversations. Fascinated by the foreign policy stuff. This is Michael Maloof, former senior security policy analyst in the Office of Secretary of Defense, author, and regular contributing analyst on RT and other media outlets. He has 30 years of federal service in the U.S. Department of Defense. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time for our last hour this morning, the last hour of the most disruptive show covering news and events in those states and outside them. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Going to headlines in the news this morning. Well, Spain has said that 355,000 more people were left unemployed in the third quarter this year, bringing the total jobless rate up to 16.3% from 15.3% in the previous 3-month period. This is due to surging infections and new virus restrictions that have hurt economic development. The National Statistics Institute said Tuesday that the total number of people out of work now in Spain stands at 3.7 million. Some 1 million people lost their jobs in the second quarter as the effects of lockdowns during the first virus wave crippled that economy. And again, this comes as the Prime Minister over the weekend justified decisions to put further lockdowns in effect, as again, they're facing the second wave in Europe. And in the United States, it seems like we're facing our third wave, but we might want to come back to that tomorrow when we're talking with Dr. Kogan. In Italy, protests took place on Monday over new restrictions to curb the country's second wave of COVID. Clashes were reported in the northern cities of Milan and Turin. I love Turin. I want to go back there. We got a friend there. Anyway, petrol bombs were thrown at officers there. In Milan, tear gas was used to disperse protesters, and thousands of people gathered in the center of Naples. The demonstrators began soon after the national government's order to close restaurants, bars, gyms, and cinemas came into effect at 6 p.m. local time. Back in national news for COVID, coming from the perspective of the United States, according to various reports, President Trump plans to announce an initiative to issue early vaccines for COVID-19 free of cost to recipients of Medicare and Medicaid. The administration is expected to announce a plan to cover vaccines that receive emergency use authorization from the Food and Drug Administration. That change could help millions receive a coronavirus vaccine for free. And this comes as the United States has reported more than 74,300 new cases of the coronavirus on Monday. That pushed the country's daily average over the past week above 71,000. That is the most in any week-long period during the pandemic so far. So we are in, if you're going to look at the rate of change of the total number of cases, we're in one of those serious upswings. Those serious inclinations is a technical term for it that I'm pulling out of nowhere. But you're stepping up. There's an incline that you're facing. Anyway, Jamarl, I'm actually going to come back to Italy for a second, just because you said that you loved it. Did you ever stay in Turin? Did you ever pass through Torino or Turin?
No, we were in Milan. We were in what's the other place? The capital? I can't think of the capital.
Rome?
Rome. We were in Rome. Duh. We were in Rome, Milan, and we went to, there was one other place, Venice. My wife and I.
That seems awesome.
Yeah, Venice was mind-blowingly beautiful. Like, it's shocking when you walk out there. What my wife and I tend to do was try to get layovers. Most people hate layovers, but we would try to get the layover to allow us like 24 hours to explore certain parts, kind of like an extra trip on the side. No, I enjoyed it, but we didn't get the opportunity to go to Turin.
It's beautiful. That was maybe I was on this like multi-month hitchhiking trip in Europe, like about a 2.5-month hitchhiking trip, and it basically ended in Turin because while I was staying in the Swiss Alps hiking around and stuff, I caught pneumonia, and it kind of got exacerbated, and I was couch surfing with somebody in Turin, and it got really bad there. I had to be hospitalized briefly, and then with that, I kind of gave up. I was like, I'm in a little bit over my head. I'm recovering from a medical crisis. I'm going to go back home. So I left. That was the end of my trip. But it's a beautiful city. It's built on this sort of Napoleonic layout where the city is very like orderly in terms of the quote unquote downtown areas. And these like just magnificent several 100-year-old buildings. It's kind of incredible in its way. And it seems like a unique experience. Anyway, moving on to other headlines. Election day, just 1 week away today. More than 59 million total ballots have been cast as of Monday morning. That's yesterday morning, suggesting a record turnout for this year's race compared to the 47.2 million early votes cast in the 2016 election. The number of early ballots cast so far represents 43.1% of the total national voter turnout in 2016. Of course, this could have more to do with the coronavirus than any widespread sense of political participation or excitement in the American public, but we'll have to see, I suppose. Jamarl, do you think that people are truly excited? What do you think is affecting this early turnout?
You said, what do I think is going to affect the turnout?
What do you think is affecting this early turnout? Yeah, why do you think people are so engaged? In other words, do you think it's the pandemic, or do you think that if everybody's really excited about either Biden or Trump, or what's your take?
No, I think I think the people are terrified. I think they want to get Trump out. I honestly do believe, like, if I could look at any of the metrics and I had to pick any metric that determined who won, who lost, I would say COVID. It's that difference between the public itself. I think it was like 60%. It was like, yeah, we're okay with the national mask mandate. Well, the moment that you see that and you see Donald Trump is completely against it, like, meaning the public understands that he is diametrically opposed to the position that the public holds. I think those large numbers are those people trying to give Trump his walking papers. I don't think the large numbers are an indication that things are going to go well for Trump in the election. I think it's the opposite. I could be wrong. I suspect it's COVID and Trump. I think it's the combination of those two things. They want to get him out of office, even if that means putting in Biden, who apparently the overwhelming majority don't like, meaning for the sample of presidency. It's sad. It's sad. It really is.
It is sad. It is, yeah. I mean, another side of this, though, is I could see Democrats being more likely to vote by mail vote early than Republicans, but we'll see where this goes. More comment. In any event, Judge Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed yesterday. She is a conservative appeals court judge and protege of former Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, and of course, she had been nominated to the Supreme Court. She was confirmed she will be joining that court. Republicans overcame unanimous Democratic opposition to make Judge Barrett the 115th Justice of the Supreme Court and the 5th woman ever to be nominated successfully to that court. The vote was 52-48, with all but one Republican, that's Susan Collins of Maine, supporting her. It was the first time in 151 years that a justice was confirmed without the support of a single member of the minority party. Vice President Joe Biden on Monday night slammed the rushed and unprecedented, that's a quote, rushed and unprecedented confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett. He issued a condemnation in a lengthy statement released shortly after Barrett was officially sworn in. A quote here from that statement: "The rushed and unprecedented confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett as Associate Justice to the Supreme Court in the middle of an ongoing election should be a stark reminder to every American that your vote matters." Quote, end quote, with him trying, of course, to encourage people to vote for him. As we're a week out from the election, Barrett will begin hearing cases immediately. And again, she is the 5th female justice in the court's history. In foreign policy news, around 10,000 people in Bangladesh rallied in the South Asian nation's capital on Tuesday to protest France's president and his staunch support of secular laws that deem caricatures depicting the Prophet Muhammad as protected under freedom of speech. Protesters from the conservative Islami Andolan Bangladesh group, which supports the introduction of a blasphemy law in the Muslim-majority country, carried banners and placards reading "All Muslims of the world unite" and "Boycott France." It was the largest protest yet against the cartoons in recent days. Some carried portraits of French President Emmanuel Macron with an X on his face. One protester carried a cutout image of the French president with shoes around his neck as a sign of insult. Jamarl, earlier on, you were talking about how you see this as sort of necessary for France as a secular country.
Yeah.
I mean, here's the other side of this, and I agree with you fundamentally, but I just want to play devil's advocate for a second. The other side of this is France needs to do nation-building-y stuff. They need to try to unify their nation. They have a substantial minority Muslim population. Admittedly, they want to be a secular society, and that, historically, at least, the assumption there is that will help to resolve religious differences. But the other side of this is they need to figure out some new way forward that's not going to perpetually divide their country over this larger historical religious crisis moment that we're in, with conflicts between, Islam and other religions in this weird, deeper sense where, this keeps happening. What's your take on this, Jamarl?
It's not that France is doing great. It's more so that from the standpoint of individual liberty, you can't have it both ways. Either you have some level of individual liberty, meaning you have the liberty to not respectfully deal with other people. If you make a Jesus cartoon, for example, well, you have that right to do that within the context of a society where you don't have to be under this allegiance. I agree with you that France needs to do something different, but that part they can't give up. That seems to be a non-negotiable component to it. Now, running on the beaches and ripping off hijabs from people's heads is absurd. And this is the nonsense that they have French police doing. I don't know if you've seen this, where French cops will go on the beach because it's illegal, apparently, to have this, like the head scarves and stuff like that on. I mean, that gets absurd. Like, leave people to their devices. At that point, you're going beyond this notion of individual liberty, and you're going into something else where this gets into more authoritarian stuff under the guise of individual liberty. Because it's not. I mean, if that person wants to worship, they can worship whoever they worship. The issue here goes into this notion of the rest of the society and the laws that are necessary in order to keep this kind of balance in your society, where killing somebody because they disrespected, quote unquote, somebody who you consider to be important, that's absurd. It's like somebody talked about my mom, so it's okay for me to murder that person. Well, clearly that's nonsense. It doesn't work that way. France, I don't know the line on that, meaning I don't know how you can back away from that if you're France. By the same token, can you try to find other ways to deal with your community, and that way in a way that brings everybody into the fold without alienation? There has to be a way. I just don't believe that it's one or the other. There has to be some middle ground in this. But the murder, can't be tolerated. Agree. Yeah, that can't be tolerated.
Well, and I mean, another side of this is that, and specifically in terms of international relations, but even on a deeper, even philosophical level, maybe in terms of political philosophy, this is deeply, the history of not just religious differences, but racism. That's all tied into France's colonial legacy. Any former colonial nation, any former colonial empire really has this sort of baggage that it needs to work through as it's dealing with, demographic differences and civil differences, not just in its country, not just in mainland, but in its relations with former colonized states. And that definitely, I'm just bringing that up.
Well, also the colonies.
One elephant in the room here.
Well, the other elephant is the colonies and a perception of inferiority that comes along with being colonized. Like those things can come in tandem. Like when people are talking about like African Americans, and you'd have this odd schism between somebody who's darker versus lighter skin. Well, that schism is coming in from the history of the country itself, where it's almost as if you trend closer to white, you're better off, versus trending closer to black, which you're not, which is weird, as if this color distinction has anything to do with the individual or the person themselves. It's entirely conceptual. Well, same thing. You have a situation where you have a dominant country that lauded itself over its colonies, and you have colonies that may take a certain perspective, whether they want to or not, over similar items. Like, so when they had the colonies, I think it was Lebanon, and they were calling for France to come in and assist with their rule. Well, I mean, if that's not an inferiority complex, meaning we don't have the capability of doing this ourselves, so we need our colonial rulers to come back in and try to affect it. All of those things get mismatched into individuals, human being psychology, when you have these kind of great disparities in force and power in the way that they had colonies. I think all of this stuff gets intermeshed into this kind of weird mix of ugh, and trying to find a solution out of it. It's not always the easiest thing.
It's not. No,
that's to put it mildly, right?
Not.
That's an understatement.
Especially when, even if I mean, just I'm going to close it out here. Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. In closing, we got to go into a break here. We'll be back in a minute. It's not even just that, if you're thinking about this from a sort of board game or a gaming perspective or whatever, it's like you assume that you have full control on the reins of power to make decisions as a country. But if you're a leader of a country, you really don't. You're having to work with coalitions and coalitions of coalitions and private political interests and, economic interests that are weighing on you. It's all super messy. And so I criticize politicians every day, but I kind of want to give them the benefit of the doubt some of the time, at least, to be like, yeah, that does sound difficult. In any event, random empathy there. We'll see if that comes back. We're going into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be back with Ted Rall on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and our guest for this segment and the next, Ted Rall. He's a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist who you can follow, by the way, on Twitter at Ted Rall. That's R-A-L-L. And that Ted, by the way, is spelled T-E-D, in case you were wondering again. Ted Rall on Twitter. You can also check out his website, RALL.com, Rall.com. Ted, thank you for being with us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good, Shane. How are you?
Good. Yeah, thank you for joining us. I'll start here. What do you think? I'm guessing that you know about this. You've been looking into this a little bit. What do you think about the whole Hunter Biden laptop scandal? We don't have a name for it, as far as I can tell. There's not like a gate name. It's not like Laptop Gate or something. It's kind of a dorky name for a political scandal. So we don't have a handy term to use to throw around for this one. But what do you think about what's been going on with this, Ted?
Everything's going to be a gate forever. I'm hoping there's going to be a gate. It should be Hunter Gate. I think this is a story that people don't care about but should care about, because what it does is it kind of puts Donald Trump and Joe Biden on a similar plane when it comes to corruption and issues of conflicts of interest, nepotism. It's very difficult for Joe Biden to keep the high ground, given what we know about this situation. I mean, what we know is that Hunter Biden was working for pretty much without qualification at a $50,000 to $60,000 a month job. That, good work if you can get it. A no-show job for Burisma, the largest energy concern in Ukraine, and that while this was going on, Joe Biden, the vice president, Hunter's father, called up the government of Ukraine and asked them, and they acceded to fire the chief prosecutor of Ukraine, the equivalent of the attorney general of that country, to get rid of him, and in the midst, while he was investigating Burisma. Now, the defense here, such as it is that this prosecutor was a bad prosecutor, that he himself was corrupt. Perhaps, we don't know that, but the point is that this was undeniably a conflict of interest. Joe Biden ought to have recused himself from such a call, even if, just to put this in proper framing, even if Joe Biden hadn't made the call and someone else in the administration had made the call, there still would have been a conflict of interest. And the thing about conflict of interest is the appearance of a conflict of interest is politically a conflict of interest. Whether, Joe Biden's heart was pure and he could have objectively dealt with Ukraine without one thought or care for the fate of the company that was paying his son so handsomely. Then, of course, also Biden took meetings with people who were connected through Hunter's connection, which is, of course, why, obviously, Burisma hired Hunter, not for his awesome knowledge of alternative energy development. So, they were hiring a Rolodex. Hunter Biden had one person in that Rolodex that the government of Ukraine was interested in having a connection to, and that Burisma had an interest in. So the fact is that even the New York Times called this soft corruption as opposed to hard corruption. That was a defense. Once you're talking about what kind of corruption you're involved in, you're playing defense, and it's yucky.
Well, I assumed it was his stunning and sparkling personality, which is the reason why they hired him for the Ukrainian for the Burisma company. This is such a weird case because you're right. The very appearance of impropriety is in of itself basically impropriety. And if you're in a political situation, you have 320 million people in a country, they don't know you. And so the very optics of this makes it look horrendous. And, beyond the optics of it, there's a certain common sense associated with it that Hunter Biden was qualified for the position because Hunter Biden had the last name Biden, which makes him perfectly qualified for what Burisma needed him to be. Do you think this matters, though? And what I mean is, I understand, yes, this is corruption, whatever you want to call it. And I don't believe for a moment that Biden didn't have it. I believe Joe Biden didn't have a conversation with Hunter Biden in the same way I believe Bill Clinton, when she was talking to Loretta Lynch, wasn't talking about the fact that his wife might get perp-wogged. I don't buy it. I do believe that that's his kid. They're talking about the energy company. Yeah, why wouldn't you bring that up? Or why wouldn't you have that conversation? It looked like it would be weird for you not to have the conversation, even if it's just, hey, that position is somewhat inopportune for me to be VP. I guess what I'm getting at is, does it matter at the end of the day? Meaning, has Trump so thoroughly freaked out the political establishment and the population where they look at this and they don't care? They say, look, we got to get Trump out of office. I don't care about this corruption, and basically turn a blind eye to it. Does it matter?
Well, it's not going to matter for the election. I don't think it's going to move the needle even a little bit. And the reason I say that is because in interacting with Biden supporters, most of whom were marched against the Iraq war, they won't even consider addressing the fact that Joe Biden not only voted for to invade Iraq, but gathered the votes that put the Senate over the top to authorize that war. That war never would have happened without Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz, but it also never would have happened without Joe Biden. Joe Biden had never lived. Iraq, 1 million people in Iraq would be alive today. God knows how many people would not have been injured. We never talk about people who were maimed in these wars. And people, they're so determined to vote against Donald Trump and, blue no matter who, that it doesn't matter. They don't care. It's like Joe Biden could be, a bestialist. They're still going to vote for him. It doesn't matter. So like the Burisma stuff, the Hunter stuff, under normal circumstances, you would expect there to be swing voters that this would affect. But I think this is a turnout game now. This election is entirely about who you get to show up, but very few people are really, I guess I've seen them on television being interviewed. I'm like, who are these people who can't decide between Biden and Trump? But there are some, but they're very few. So if it moves the needle, I guess it could move the needle a point or two, maybe. But it's not going to be as determinative as I think Hillary's emails, for example, or the statement by Comey back in 2016, shortly before the election, that he was investigating Hillary Clinton. I don't think that decided the election, but I think it moved the needle a little more.
Ted, we've got a couple of minutes left in this segment. I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit early. We're going into a break in about 4 minutes, and usually, you split up segments topically. But I'm curious. I just want to move right into it. What did you think about this last debate? You're just saying that sliver of the electorate whose opinions might be changed is probably smaller than a lot of political speculators think. So on the one hand, the debate might not really change much. On the other hand, I'm curious, what do you think? Ted, what's your take?
Well, what blew me away about the debate wasn't the debate itself. It was the mainstream corporate media coverage of the debate. And the fact that I'm reading in the New York Times and the Washington Post the next day that Joe Biden was, quote unquote, sharp. Joe Biden wasn't sharp. Joe Biden isn't ever sharp. He doesn't do sharp. And he certainly wasn't sharp that night. He mistakenly claimed that that his watered down version of the Green New Deal was going to kick in 2025 as opposed to 2035. If that were true, I would have considered voting for him, but it's not true. He also mistakenly said that the crime bill was in the 80s. It was 1994. But in terms of the debate itself, I don't think that moves the needle much. Donald Trump showed, as he has shown in the past, that he can be disciplined and on message. He certainly was told not to interrupt, and he didn't. He had opportunities to do so, chose not to. I think that the big takeaway for me was just how completely unresponsive both parties are to the very pressing needs of the American people who have lost their jobs, their homes, their businesses, and their relatives who have lost their lives, or people who have survived COVID and are suffering medical problems. There was no real discussion of how we should move forward on health care, economic stimulus, and so on. I mean, it was just a lot of dumb gotcha. It wasn't a debate on issues. And I think that was more true in this cycle than it's been in previous cycles. And it's ironic considering that there's so much more at stake.
Yeah, that's the most bizarre and the thing I think I had the most anger against the political system about. Like, you look at all of the people that are ill, all of the people that are injured from this virus, didn't have to be this way. You look at the number of people who are being thrown out of their homes. You look at the number of people, not just thrown out of their homes, but lost their jobs or their businesses. And like you said, you look at this and think it didn't have to be this way. And despite having multiple crises, I mean, when FDR came in office, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. And he basically rallied all the powers of the federal government at his disposal in order to try to deal with the Great Depression. Well, at this point, not only do we have the food lines, not only do we have the millions or the tens of millions of people out of a job, you also have death on top of it. So it's like all of this stuff comes at once. And both political parties just seems to be not there. Like, it seems to be an afterthought as opposed to actually marshaling the government to deal with it. Let's do this. Let's take an early break. And we're going to bring you back. And I'm going to let you respond to that, the difference and the distinction between how we were as a country in dealing with crisis like this versus how we are now and the tone deafness of the two parties. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. This is Ted Rall, who's joining us, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan. Joining us today is Ted Rall, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Ted, we were getting into this notion that the American public, more in this election than any other time that I've seen it, seems to be an afterthought. Meaning this notion of you have nowhere else to go, whether it's to African Americans or to lefties, have been expanded to the rest of the population. And basically 70-80% agree. We got to vote Joe Biden in to get Donald Trump out. This is not aspirational politics. And this is not, you have nothing to fear but fear yourself type of stuff. This is basically, vote for me because I'm not Trump. Or vote for me because I'm not Biden. And the American public is basically stuck with these two pointing fingers at each other. Basically two people in a Spider-Man costume pointing at the other guy as the bad guy. So why do you think that's so drastically different this time around? Meaning, at the time where you actually need competent leadership, or you need the government to respond in ways that are Herculean to try to deal with these crises, both parties seem to not be up to the task. Why? Why have we gotten to that point? Why have we degraded that much as a society where the two political parties seem to be incapable of even addressing or dealing with it?
Well, my current book, Political Suicide, is about this entire topic. Basically, we're looking at a long-term historical trend. If you are old enough to remember, I'm 57, there has not, the Democratic Party, much less the Republican Party, hasn't even proposed an anti-poverty program since Lyndon B. Johnson was president in the mid-60s. That's a long, long time. The anti-poverty programs were a very standard part of Democratic politics for most of the middle of the 20th century. And then they sort of, starting with Jimmy Carter, went away. And it's not like anybody who lives, anywhere in the U.S. certainly knows that poverty is still a big problem. By many metrics, it's been getting worse, and that's not a coincidence. So the high point of American liberalism as a attempt, as a project to reform capitalism is, as you mentioned before the break, FDR's New Deal. And it's breathtaking in its scale by contemporary standards. Roosevelt put 14 million people on the federal payroll, not just with handouts, but with programs like the NRA, the National Recovery Act, and the CCC, and there were even poets and playwrights and authors and painters and even cartoonists were put on the federal payroll because they wanted to not only get people back to work, they also wanted to build infrastructure and create art and get society moving again. This is when Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security were all invented. They didn't exist before then. Or I should say Medicare, not Medicaid. And so these programs, it revolutionized, it created a social safety net. And I think it's important to understand two things. First of all, the Great Depression was not as serious in terms of the unemployment rate as the current depression. The United States basically achieved 25% maximum unemployment by 1933, 1934. That was the peak. For most of the Great Depression, unemployment was really down in the teens, like 12, 13%. People forget that. But we achieved real unemployment of 25% 2 or 3 months into the coronavirus. So it happened bigger and it happened quicker this time around putting forth, with the population adjustment, the equivalent of what FDR accomplished would be to hire about 40 to 45 million people and put them on the federal payroll. Now here's the real kicker. FDR's program didn't even go far enough. It didn't get us out of the Depression. It mitigated the harm. It was only World War II that really got the American economy moving fast enough. So this is all to say, the only way that capitalism can save itself at this point is to go really, really, really big, even bigger than FDR went. But why are we not doing that? Because clearly both parties are enthralled to corporate interests. And there's a division in the ruling classes. Some corporations and CEOs understand that it's important to stimulate the economy. Otherwise, they're looking at a complete collapse. But the other half of the ruling classes, the cheapskates, who are just after the short-term quarterly profits and don't want to pay higher taxes, they're winning that argument. And they've been winning that argument for the better part of half a century.
That just sounds okay. So I'm going to respond to it on those terms because there are things that we could get into an interesting conversation on. I could push back on stuff about FDR. That could become its own thing. But just responding to it on its own terms, that sounds, from another perspective, like a political system in pure decline. Sort of, if you strip away any ideological perspective, if you strip away, the genuine meritorious arguments that the U.S. should be doing more, that the Democrats should have put forward a poverty plan sometime in the last 50 years, say, and that we should be doing more consistently to try to make, society a better place for the people who live in it. If you sort of put aside what could become an ideological debate, which is a little bit less interesting, that does sound, in some pure sense, like the power elites within a society, oligarchically, trying to preserve their control over the levers of that society. You said something about, if capitalism wants to save itself, it needs to go big, or it's going to go home. I kind of want to take that same idea but apply it to this. What would it take from the power elite's perspective? What would it take for those elites to come to some sense about what they need to do? Is it just more crises? Is it larger and larger crises until it escalates? What's on the other side of the ellipsis here, Ted?
Well, Marx would say it's not going. They won't come to their senses. They can't come to their senses in the same way that you can't get your cat to bark or your dog to meow. It's just not in their nature to think in a different way. But certainly theoretically, I guess if I want to wallow in a little bit of magical thinking, one would need to see a deeper, more frightening existential crisis that makes them believe that they're physically in peril, and that if they don't switch it up yesterday, that they're going to be in big trouble. They're going to lose everything they have, maybe even their lives. I think then maybe they'd wake up. I don't think they would, but anything short of that, I don't think stands a chance.
Yeah, I'm skeptical also. Because basically they have to fully believe that somehow they're going to lose in this. Because in normal circumstances, these guys are in a bubble. If the economy tanks, if the economy does great, they continue to do great. It seems like in these depressions, when the market hits the skids and everything else, at the end of the day, you're already going to know who's going to end up on top, regardless of what happens. And so I think it's one of those things where if there's this belief that I'm going to be fine regardless of what happens, then I'm less invested in the things that take place, with the exception of my own financial, this kind of increase in my own finances. I guess I have a hard time even coming up with an existential threat that's big enough where they would be like, okay, yeah, we have to do something different. I don't know what that is. And that's terrifying. Because basically you have a country where a section of that country, a very wealthy section of that country, is looking out for their own self-interest. And in looking out for their own self-interest, they're going to make certain appraisals about how dangerous or how existential a particular threat is. And of course, there's always a subjective, or there's always a bias element to that of, I think I can make it through this. I think I'll be okay. I mean, keep in mind, it was FDR that made the argument that I saved capitalism. And I think that's where you're getting that from. That basically either the system implodes or you have to do something to reinvigorate the system. That sounds like your argument, Mark. I'm Ted. That basically we need to reinvigorate the system if we're looking for anything to come out of it, or if we're not looking for it to skits. In fact, there's an article that just came out in BuzzFeed. I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday. And this scary statistics predicts growing U.S. political violence, whatever happens on Election Day. And they're basically saying whether Biden wins or whether Trump wins, the trend in U.S. politics is for inequality to grow, for people who are in power to maintain their grip on power, and for a lessening of democracy. And when all of those things together, this notion of a secondary civil war or this notion of a secondary conflict becomes that much more viable. What do you think about that? I mean, they're basically making this point that, look, we're in for rough times, regardless of who the president is, because both of these people basically are going to keep the system ticking along the way the system has been ticking along, which is to the detriment of the system, might I add.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And but I do think that like sort of the way that things will play out under a second Trump or a first Biden administration, there's some differences, but I think overall the end result will be similar. I think in a second Trump administration, there's a scenario in which he is reelected, probably through a 12th Amendment scenario, where and he ends up with a Democratic House and Senate, and that House and Senate push through a large stimulus package. And, he signs the first one, and maybe he thinks, okay, well, I'll just sign this one too. As long as my name goes on the check, that's all I care about. I'll take credit. He does understand the need for stimulus, clearly. So maybe he cooperates with the Democrats and there's a big stimulus package. Or maybe he's petulant and we end up with gridlock, as we've seen since the benefits and the stimulus ran out in late June. And so maybe with Trump, it's an all or none scenario. I think with Biden, you end up with a half Band-Aid over the wound. In a weird way, Democrats are more likely to compromise with themselves, against themselves, and go smaller. We saw that instinct, particularly with Clinton, but to some extent with Obama as well. There's been the head of the Ted Kaufman, the head of the Biden transition team, said openly that he espouses austerity. He thinks that they'll come in and find the cupboards bare fiscally, and that therefore it's going to be hard to go big with stimulus to save the economy if the Democrats win. So I think, with Trump, you get either the whole hog or nothing at all. And so collapse happens either much later or very soon. And with Biden, it's sort of somewhat slow death. But the thing is with Biden is, in a weird way, I think it's a more combustible mixture politically, because nothing is more dangerous than a population that's desperate, has hope, and then sees that hope dashed on the shoals of disappointment. And I think that's Biden, I think, is predisposed to disappoint.
I think can't help but agree. But I wonder what will happen if instead of being dashed on the shoals, you're just sort of moored there for week after week or month after month or year after year. I think the tempers get a little bit less fiery in a weird way if you get used to it. There's something about ennui and how that stuff kind of kicks in and drags you down. Another perspective on that, you're talking about a sort of bimodal scenario with Trump there, where either, he fails horribly, and that's widely noticed and widely responded to and reacted to, or he succeeds in some sense in giving people what they need. And Biden is splitting the difference, and in the process, not making much of a difference. I'm going to be honest here. I kind of prefer the former. I'm not voting for Trump, but if there's a scenario, we're talking about, I'll put it like this, we're talking about rates of change yesterday when it comes to inflation. And then the same thing got brought up. We were talking about COVID. With inflation, you have the rate of change of the creation of money. And then you can take the second derivative, which is the rate of change of the rate of change, how fast inflation is changing. Same principle applies to an infection. First thing is, how quickly are people being infected? And the second thing is, how quickly is that rate changing? Well, in politics, you'd have, at least hopefully, optimistically, some positive rate of change of response, where the political system, in terms of the policies that it's enacting, putting forward and enacting, they're being realized politically quickly. And then ideally, you'd have that rate of change improving. This is maybe a little bit too singularitarian or techie or whatever, but ideally you'd get that. We have the exact opposite. The rate of change of stagnation seems to be increasing. It seems like our government is getting less and less effective at responding to stuff over time. And in some sense, I think a lot of people back in 2016 and still in 2020 just kind of want it either to be solved or for something else to come up in its place. Either the system should be reformed or, break it down and build something else better back up out of it. Ted, I want to take you in. We got a taking calls segment, next segment. I'm going to give you a minute or two to respond here before we go out. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I personally share your instinct. I would, again, I already voted. I did not vote for Donald Trump. I voted for Howie Hawkins. But I don't think that the Biden approach is, the sort of soft neoliberal, post Jimmy Carter Democrat approach is going to be enough for this moment, and it's gonna, it's gonna be painful and long, and it's almost like you want. It's like, what would you rather have? Like when you have 4 wisdom teeth that need to be pulled, would you rather do them all at once, or would you rather do them one at a time? There's arguments for both. I'm a do them all at the same time kind of guy. That way, like, it's going to be a rough week, but I'll be okay at the end of the week. And I think, I think the sort of slow spiral down the toilet that we're experiencing now is extremely psychically and, of course, obviously, physically and financially damaging to the people who live here.
That's, what the same page with wisdom teeth too, and how you should handle those kinds of things. In any event, Ted Rall, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
For those listening, Ted Rall, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow him on Twitter at Ted Rall. That's R-A-L-L, Rall with 2 L's. And you can check out his cartoons and articles at rall.com. We're taking calls on the other side of this break. The phone number is 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in 1 minute.
Fault Lines.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back and we're taking calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320. And the title of the show is Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. It's not technically part of the title, but I'm throwing it in there because those are our names. And frankly, if you're going to be listening to our voices, you should probably know who you're listening to. But again, we're taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number to call if you want to join us. Jamarl. It probably came across in my voice. I had a rough weekend, and I don't really want to get into it. still processing some stuff here. And I think I'm going to be moving back out to South Dakota, back out to the Midwest. I'm just throwing that in there because it might be an elephant in the room for people who are subtly attuned to the changes in people's speech patterns and thought patterns and such. Anyway, that's where I'm at. But you know what made me happy earlier was our brief conversation about traveling in Italy. You said that you guys did layovers there.
Yeah,
that was how you were doing it. Were you doing that with like frequent flyer miles? Or
No.
How'd you get that set up?
So back in 2016, I think it was the year after we got married, we decided, let's travel the world. Because when you're in the United States and anywhere you try to leave, it's expensive. It costs so much money. Like trying to get into Europe is expensive, but once you're in Europe, it's cheap to travel there. So if let's say for 5 years, you're taking a trip into Europe or a trip into so forth, that's a lot of money. Whereas if you just do it all at once, you could save a ton of cash. And so the thought was, all right, how do we make this where we just do this in perpetuity? Well, I started doing my channel. My wife starts doing medical coding. And so then it becomes, okay, well, we just need to get rid of the house. We need to figure out somewhere for the dogs. Like at that point, it becomes a thing of how do you make this work? Well, what we ended up doing was we would jump from country to country. But every so often, there would be opportunities where you can spend the day in a country. So Qatar, for example, when we spent the day there. I think we spent like maybe 8 hours. Venice, same thing. I think we spent maybe a day in Venice, but that was just because of the way the flights went. What we do is we try to use the layovers. And when those layovers are like 8 hours or 12 hours, especially if it's in a country we haven't been to or we want to tour, we take advantage of the layovers. And so where most people hate layovers, we try to use them for exploits, meaning for what we can get out of them.
Yeah. That sounds cool. I could see that. Instead of making the layovers shorter, you kind of want them to be longer because again, if you have a full day, that's way better than just having the 4 hours that it would take to literally step outside of the airport and then step back in for your on-time international flight. I'm curious though, where my mind goes is that sounds really fast-paced.
It is.
So how was it? How was that? And well, I'm guessing that this was, hopefully this was interlaced with longer stays.
It was.
In other places.
So let's say, for example, we would jump into Kenya. And the thought is, okay, it's going to take 2 weeks for a pay period and that type of stuff. So basically you hunker down in one country for maybe a week or two. And then at the point where your payments and everything else are coming into play, like your paychecks, at that point you make the jump. And so it's like there's usually a 2 or 3 week time period to build up your account before you make the next jump into the next place. And you're kind of paying it as you go ahead. That's usually only after like 2 weeks though. Maybe a week. A week is even too short. Like because, after a while you just get hectic. It's like as soon as you unpack, you're ready to pack again. But when you're doing that part though, the airlines is usually holding onto your luggage. So you don't have your luggage. And usually in most places, Qatar didn't have it, but usually in most places you could put whatever carrying stuff that you have and just sit it there for the day. Because keep in mind that by the time you get to the next place, even if you are traveling for 24 hours straight, you can rest the next day, wherever you are going to end up. And so it is hectic in the moment. But from the elongation of the trip itself, when you're looking at, let's say like 4 months, well, this might be like 4 days out of 4 months to visit 4 locations just for the course of the day. So it's not insane, but it is hectic.
It would be. And I mean, here's another side of that. We talk sometimes about general relativity. I don't even know why we talk about it, but it just keeps coming up. This idea of time dilation. There's a sort of time dilation that comes into play when you're in those fast-paced trip environments, when you're doing a bunch of stuff where like 14 days have passed and instead of feeling like 2 weeks, it feels like 2 months or 2 years. It's crazy. And especially if you add a little bit of sleeplessness in there, not only does that add more time, but it adds a little bit more of the sense of surrealism, whatever. It gets interesting, but I bet you had some great experiences,
Oh man, it was great. I mean, there's like the conceptual dimension of it and there's the objective dimension of it. And so it's like you have this conceptual dimension of time where, like you said, sometimes it feels like it's longer, sometimes it feels like it's shorter. And that depends almost entirely on what's going on. But then you have the objective measurement of time. But you even get the time dilation effect, believe it or not, when you're flying in those planes. If you put a clock on an airplane, in fact, I think they did this experiment, putting a clock or atomic clock on an airplane, keeping one down on the planet, the atomic clock in the sky has a different time than the one that's on the planet. Relativistic effects. Yeah. One being in a gravity well, the other one being further away from it. How weird is that? Like, even something that seems as objective as time is basically relative, depending on how fast you're going, or the gravity well that you're in. And both of those things are relatively the same. Yeah, that stuff is fascinating.
It's very interesting.
But it was a great trip, man. We had a good time. For us, every time we travel, we have to negotiate the clinic stuff, like the treatment stuff, the dialysis stuff. And so that always adds complexity to it, because you have to find where you're going to get a treatment. You got to make sure that the amounts are straight, that the information from your facility gets to where it needs to be. That's assuming that you're even working with your facility at that point. All of that stuff adds a complexity on top of it. But I wouldn't trade it. And oddly enough, you can even make an argument that the illness thing in and of itself was part of the reason for the travel, not the other way around.
Yeah, that's what kicked it off, right? That's what you've been saying
partially,
before we talked about
I
this.
think it's yeah. I think it's I think what it boils down to is not wanting to accept reality being a particular way, and it's not even being a particular way. It's somebody telling you it's that way, or the assumption that it's that way. It's this push against it. It's this thing of like, yeah, I'm not gonna accept this particular station. If there was no illness, I don't know if I would have been there. I know that sounds strange, but it's almost like the challenge in and of itself perpetuates the person forward. Like if you were brought up in a household and the expectation, let's say you had a doctor and a lawyer for parents. What's the expectation of the kid as opposed to not being brought up in that household where maybe you had parents who didn't necessarily like school, or maybe you weren't even, maybe you were raised by your grandmother. Like, I'm making the point that the expectation in and of itself creates the drive forward. Meaning the person considers it normal because the person considers it normal. That's a conceptual thing, as opposed to the objective reality of it. I've met plenty of people who would say, oh man, I used to like to travel and then I got ill. And I would ask him, well, what's changed? Well, I got ill. Yeah, no, but does that really stop you from traveling? Well, I never really thought about it. I just assumed I couldn't do it. Why did you assume that you couldn't do it? It's like a lot of those things end up being in conceptual spaces where, depending upon the person's perspective of the world or the expectations put on that person, is how that person performs. And the moment that the individual says, I can't do X, then that person's right. That person can't do X. Not literally, but because the person doesn't believe they can do it. Now, this is not like everything, right? I can't flap my arms and fly. So there's certain expectations that you don't necessarily have. But there's a lot of stuff that fits into that realm that's entirely of conceptual space, and your ability to do something is entirely tethered to whether or not you believe you can do it. And, that's where it gets more interesting, even for science. Like, imagine for the moment that the U.S. military comes out and says, you know what, right, there's something flying here. We don't know what it is, but we don't define it as us. What happens to science after that? What happens to the scientists that believe that it's impossible for something to come here? And that scientist says, okay, well, clearly something is coming here. So what does that mean from the standpoint of our understanding of the stuff? And the moment that those guys start to question that and start looking for that answer will be available. It's no different. A lot of this stuff becomes conceptual.
That happens with piecewise claims. That happens with specific atomic claims where you get something that contradicts that claim. And then, what you're kind of hinting at there, what you're talking about more widely, is the paradigm shift, where you have a way of looking at things generally, a perspective or a sort of universe of ideas that you develop. And of course, this applies to science, but it applies to people too. And then something comes in and it starts to contradict it, and usually you ignore it. Usually you ignore the contradictory evidence. But that's for a while. At some point, you have to stop ignoring it. You can't help but stop ignoring it. That's at least the hope. And specifically, this is Thomas Kuhn's idea of the structure of scientific revolutions, or his idea of the paradigm shift from his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Anyway, we're going into the last minute of our show here, so I'm going to close it out with this. This does tie into politics too. You have a political universe living in. You have a set of philosophical ideas and ideas about how policy is supposed to be accomplished, and ideas about how your nation is supposed to relate to other nations. And in a weird way, you're responding to evidence, both internally from what the society wants and externally from the material realities of the world that society is dealing with. You're responding to evidence that you've got to update on in order to improve and change your society and the way that it works and the structure of your political system. All that stuff applies to our politicians. Are, if we hold them to it, in the long run, even if we don't, they're held to this. We've got to wrap. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back tomorrow. Thanks for listening, folks.
Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan. That's another one in the books. Great show. Ended on an interesting philosophical point, I suppose. But no, great show. I want to thank all of you for joining us for another episode. You will be seeing this mug a little bit later today. I have a few shows that I want to get in. I just want to make sure I did not miss anyone. Yeah, man, that's an interest. The Sabrina B, he knows, but he didn't have anything to do with it. Oh, you're probably talking about Biden. I think you're probably talking about Biden. Darren Levy, if Biden somehow gets in, do you think the economy crashes? Oh, right, I did say that. Look, if Biden gets in, then the question becomes, what does Biden do? Does Biden, does a switch flip and Joe Biden all of a sudden, becomes this raging lefty? Or do I expect Joe Biden to act basically like Obama and basically like Kamala Harris? Basically take things back to what they consider to be status quo and normality. And to position themselves in a way where they could say the Republicans are maniacs, vote for us. Missing the fact that the Democrats allow them to be maniacs because the Democrats are so feckless and weak in regards to policy stuff. And you must understand, this is not because they entirely disagree with Republicans regarding their weakness on policy stuff. This is because they generally agree. It's the opposite of those things. If you have dollars and pitchforks in your party, you have a party of the rich and you have people who are dirt poor, and those people are in the same party. Where does the party lean? This idea of a big tent stuff is nonsense. The objective of a political party is to get certain things accomplished. And ideally, you have people in your society that say, we want X. Those people go up and represent those other people who are in the society. Well, in normal circumstances in our politics, you just have a bunch of people who are representing the oligarchical class. You don't have somebody who's there representing the interests of workers. A person who is fighting in the interests of workers to the exclusion of the other items, or at the very least to a lesser priority the other items, would say Medicare for all is the best thing for the public. We're in the pandemic. We need to deal with the medical bills. We need to deal with the vaccines and the vaccinations. And we also need to deal with contact testing, tracing, etc. Let's let Medicare do it. But on top of that, let's ensure that everybody is covered. Well, if you're working for workers, that's a point of view that you're probably going to take because you're looking out for the interests of the workers and you want to have a less bill with maximum service. Now, if you're looking out for the oligarchs and you're looking out for the rich in the way that most political parties do in this country, then you don't care about that. That's a little less priority because from your standpoint, you have the ability to pay for your medical bills. Same thing with school. You have the ability to send your kids to school. So this issue of pushing for free college and university care and all that other stuff becomes less relevant to people who are pushing for the interests of the rich, which my contention is that both political parties are. The difference is Democrats feign and give a feint to this notion of the poor because that's an element of their party. The way the political disposition is right now, if you can keep getting a Ted Cruz and a Tom Cotton and a whatever coming up behind where you could say, those guys are maniacs. But the catch is, at some point, one of those maniacs are going to get in. Donald Trump is not the cause. Donald Trump is only a symptom. And yet an American public who was looking and wanted something so drastically different that they were willing to go to Trump as opposed to accepting somebody status quo. Well, right now you have another election coming up in about a week. And in this case, the Democratic Party basically is saying, hey, aren't we the better option even though, we're not that great? Basically a rerun of the election between Clinton and Trump. This time with a dumber version of Clinton going against Trump again. But this time Trump has 200,000 dead bodies on his ledger. making, even if it was just a ham sandwich that was running for the Democratic Party, probably better chances of winning. And that's unfortunate, because the fact is, at this moment, it becomes that much more important to hold your political leaders accountable, not less. And allowing the precedent to be set where Joe Biden can basically just be inert. I'm not Trump. That's what I'm running for. In the primaries, when he was pushed, he would take positions, but he didn't necessarily believe those positions. And now when he's running against Trump, he's just ham sandwich Biden. I'm inert. I don't have to be involved in the process. I can pretty much stay in my basement. I'm just going to say that I'm not a lefty in the way that they're trying to claim I am, or I am not weak on crime in the way they try to claim I am. So instead, Biden will be the inert candidate that would give you an alternative to Trump, not for any kind of emancipatory politics, something that's demanded right now, but entirely because you have nowhere else to go. At some point, people need to say, yes, we do, even if it means not voting for them. Like, share, and of course, subscribe, and I will see you guys in a few. Thanks all.